So where is my dream?
It is a continuation of reality.
But where is my reality?
It is at the end of your dream.
Mediation as God. Preface. Holy Volksgeister. Cultural Relativist Universalism and the Permanent Reformation of Pope Francis. The path from Catholic Orthodoxy to an ecumenical worldview, and what Ayaan Hirsi's conversation reveals about Christianity on both sides of the Atlantic.
The supranational character of the Catholic Church, which results from Roman centralism, has not, as is well known, protected it from every ignominious association with various abysses of politics over the centuries, but at least from the moral total failure of the vast majority of other Christian communities, which always quite patriotically believed that they had to submit to any degenerate regime, as long as it served the nation. The brand name Catholic itself expressed the fundamental distance from national particularisms that could never be completely suppressed, a universality ultimately adopted from the monotheism of Judaism, which values general humanity higher than race and culture, and even approaches the latter with restraint or skepticism. The Second Vatican Council, 1962 to 1965, decisively influenced by German theologians from the environment of ethnic reform movements, initiated a very regrettable revaluation of the alleged cultural peculiarities of the peoples, which goes hand in hand with the revaluation of the people of the Church vis-a-vis the Roman center. Under Pope Francis, the cult of people and peoples has reached its peak so far. With his World Synod on Synodality, continuation in October 2024, which was convened in 2023, he is striving for a structural transformation of the Church that is to take on a new form, namely a synodal one which would give the people more say. As is well known, the Church is not a democracy that simply implements an arbitrary will of the people. Rather, the people are declared to be the mouthpiece of God by those involved in the transformation process. Francis claims that the Holy Spirit is the protagonist of the process, which essentially consists of listening to the concerns of Catholic laypeople collected by national bishops' conferences and having the hand-picked synod participants vote on fundamental issues, currently mainly trendy diversity and anti-colonial nonsense. The chief coordinator of the event, Luxembourg's Cardinal Jean-Claude Hollerich, who, among other things, wants to overhaul the Church's sexual morality, also declared that the synod was undoubtedly guided by the Holy Spirit. For Francis, the people are the real bearers of church power. They are driven by the Holy Spirit to the right insights. To see the source of the Holy Spirit at work in the Church in the people, in line with the conciliarism condemned as heresy, is in direct contradiction to the doctrine represented at the First Vatican Council, 1869-70. According to which the Pope, as the Vicar of Christ, is assigned this role. According to this, the Pope has the sole fullness of the power of the shepherd, together with the charisma of infallibility. He has the assistance of the Holy Spirit in order to be the shepherd and teacher of all Christians, including bishops, as in the dogmatic Constitution Pastori Timus of 1870. Attributing the highest teaching authority to the Church as a whole was characteristic of the theological modernism that opposed the Council, for example, in the case of George Tyrrell. Its glorification and elevation of the people stems from a nationalist concept of the people, which became increasingly widespread in the Church in the 20th century, especially through the new German anti-individualist theologians. In 1932, the Reformed Catholic Romano Guardini described the people as the embodiment of all that is humanly genuine, profound, and sustaining, while Heidegger's student Karl Rahner dreamed in various writings of a church taken over by the people. Man and Faith, an essay on religious existence in Dostoevsky's great novels, Leipzig 1932, 21. Francis referred to this sentence positively in a speech on November 13, 2015. The Second Vatican Council then set the course for this. In particular, the council text Lumen Gentium, LG, provides ideologues of the people such as Francis with the arguments. He interprets LG 12, the whole body of the faithful cannot err in matters of belief, as if Christians were guided by the Holy Spirit without any mediation. At the very least, the Council clearly relativizes the significance of the papacy. LG 22 claims that the Bishop of Rome and the other bishops form a college that has supreme and full authority in the Church, even infallibility, LG 25. The authority of the Pope is now derived from the college, which as such is an invention of the Council or its reform-oriented masterminds such as Yves Congar, from which he can no longer be separated. This episcopacy, which was apparently copied from non-Catholic ecclesiologies, logically led to the de facto construction of largely autonomous national churches that behave towards each other in a collegial manner. The chairman of the German Bishops' Conference, Batzing, was accordingly indignant at his German-critical Polish colleague after the First Synod meeting in 2023, accusing him of condemning unbrotherly events in another church, namely the German one. Since then, the greatest concern in Rome has been to fall back into papalism. The coronation of the Pope was abolished under Paul VI, and further insignia were dropped by his successors. Most recently, in 2020, Francis, who now only refers to himself as the Bishop of Rome, even declared the title of Vicar of Christ to be a historical title. He is now taking the decentralization of the Church, which was initiated at the Council, even further. Under him, national special rules and synods are gaining increasing importance, which is now even softening the episcopal structure. For the Synod on Synodality, national associations of local churches first gathered opinions from the faithful, summarized them into national statements. The originally planned Synod of Bishops, as an organ of the College of Bishops, soon became a general assembly with lay participation, a people's assembly, in other words. Francis programmatically views the people of the Church under the premise of national fragmentation, which he views as unreservedly positive. The image of the Church as a polyhedron, which he chose in the encyclical Fratelli Tutti, elevates internal inhomogeneity to an ideal. This applies to both doctrine and worship. The unity of the Church becomes a patchwork. He lacks an understanding of Catholic Universalism, which is why he constantly perverts the term and turns it into its opposite. Like the post-colonial memory studies professor and author Michael Rothberg, he advocates a universalism of the multidirectional point of view, which means a general acceptance of particular characteristics. A counter-universalism, a universalization of the stupid and pernicious, of the superstition of nations. Francis wants Catholicity to be seen as a universality that does not homologize, i.e. help the general to accept, does not engage in evil proselytism, but enculturates. For example, Francis said this in a speech in Mongolia in September 2023. Of course, he is not the first to hold this position. In the 1980s, John Paul II called on indigenous Christians in America, for example, to remain authentic Native Americans, and in his encyclical Redemptoris Missio, 1990, he explicitly called on missionaries to enculturate. The Church should be integrated into the cultures of the peoples. The authentic cultural values should undergo an inner transformation in the Christian sense, whereby the gospel would come alive in the various cultures. The cultures should thus be renewed from within. There is also explicit mention of cult and theology, RM 52. Missionaries should fit into the respective socio-cultural world and discover the values of the respective culture. Then Christianity in the new communities would be harmonious with their own cultural traditions, RM 53, which is apparently a great goal. Francis, in particular, wants to promote regionally and culturally different paths of faith, not uniformity. The latter is a betrayal of the Holy Spirit, which in his opinion is even the cause of cultural differences, instead of, classically, sin, which was punished after the Tower of Babel was built. In fact, his theology is all about cultures that allow for such fascinating reinterpretations of the Gospels, as he praised them, for example, in the Ecosophists Leonardo Boff, a student of Karl Rahner from 1965 to 1970. His Motu Proprio, published during the Synod of Bishops in 2023, a papal decree that arose from his personal initiative and not from a request. Ad Theologiam Promovendum calls for contextual theology according to geographical and cultural surroundings, which, taking as its model the incarnation of the eternal Logos, enters into the culture, worldview, and religious tradition of a people. This is a disparaging and trivializing statement about Judaism, implying that Jesus burst into any old culture and adopted its ideas, including religious traditions. But he could just as easily have come to all the others. All cultures, worldviews, and religious traditions are equally good and open to the Logos. Since he did not do so, the Church should now take over this job. According to classical doctrine, however, the divine Logos once came to his people. To those who exclusively followed his religious traditions, which he had arranged himself, who had received the true, unclouded worldview exclusively from him and whose culture was therefore developed on the basis of divine wisdom and arrangement, which does not apply to all other cultures, in which there is nothing divine and which await no fulfillment from the Messiah or his Church. The last council already caused a revolution in this question. In LG 17 it is claimed that the seed of good is already in the own rights and cultures of the peoples. The Church would only elevate and perfect. And the council text Gaudium et Spes believes, GS 22, that Christ has already united with every human being in the Incarnation. Grace would work in every person of goodwill, even if he is a pagan, that he is connected to the Easter mystery and goes towards the resurrection. In the interpretation of theologians such as Rahner and his followers, this means quite openly that all religions have a positive role in the plan of salvation, as his brother in the order, Francis, confirmed with his Abu Dhabi Declaration in 2019, all religions are God-given. Accordingly, for Francis, it is no longer the doctrine and cult of the existing Church, on the basis of its universal nature, that are to be spread, but, on the contrary, the good outside the Church is to be discovered and preserved everywhere. The universal Catholic is no longer that which comes from the one true God and is conveyed through his Church to a divided and confused humanity, but rather the Church should make itself universal and submit to the supposedly already totally good world. The Catholic community should incarnate itself in everything that any self-proclaimed people considers to be their own, which therefore cannot be common to all, which means nothing other than that everyone, without changing in any way, is to be considered a redeemed brother, but without leaving the restrictive and completely different source, context of his Volksgemeinschaft. This is entirely in keeping with the woken zeitgeist, according to which the individual should not believe that he can improve himself, or even change at all. One only seeks oneself, that is, one's supposedly essential affiliation, sealing oneself off from external influences. This is not individualistic, but submission. For Francis, universality is the salvation of cultures and nations through themselves. It is the missionaries who learn, not the others. So much beauty and goodness is to be discovered in the religiosity of the pagans. We, Christians, are the ones who should expand our horizons and simply engage in self-serving dialogue. For example, Francis finds it commendable that the Mongolian people, Buddhists and animists, collectively cultivate their roots and traditions and live in harmony with the environment, while looking up to the light of goodness. Here, the blood and soil mysticism that was already unbearable in the context of the 2019 Amazon Synod is being practiced again, to suggest that a continent with which one can enter into a dialogue, and its inhabitants, who supposedly belong there naturally, have messages and wisdom, a very particular way of looking at things. And this, of course, must not change under any circumstances. In 2022, he consequently apologized to Canadian Indigenous people for the assimilation methods of earlier missionaries, who had actually dared to turn noble savages into normal Canadian citizens. The idea that a people is an indivisible unit and must be equipped with a form of Christianity that is adapted to the character of the people and correspondingly abbreviated and simplified ultimately corresponds to the concept of dynamic, i.e. adapted Christianity, as it was developed in particular among Nazi-friendly German Catholics. For example, Kuno Brombacher, the Baden representative of the Arbeitsgemeinschaft Katholischer Deutscher, Association of Catholic Germans, who later became an old Catholic and sharply criticized the encyclical Mit Brennender Sorge, with burning concern, in 1937, saw himself in Germany as the explicit representative of a dynamic Catholicism, as an opponent of the conservatives, all according to his kind. In the encyclical Laudato Si, 2015, Francis also declared that kinds, in the plant, animal, and human world, had an intrinsic value, section 33, and that any loss of any kind was per se terribly bad. Every creature belongs in its place firmly assigned by God. Even love of God is dependent on geographical space, and ultimately Francis can only imagine it through a sentimental home experience. The idolatrous place, with its hills and streams, is a very personal sign of God, LS 84, particularly, of course, through the culture that is cultivated there, which is threatened with extinction by evil globalism, or rather what the ethno-nationalist understands by it, namely the cultural heritage of the mystified place, which has an original identity that must be preserved at all costs, LS 143. Cultural diversity is a treasure for humanity, and so the rights of peoples and cultures must be protected, LS 144, and human groups must not even be prescribed an ideal of quality of life. For them, only what corresponds to their traditional habits is right. In particular, Francis is of course referring to the communities of indigenous peoples with their cultural traditions, for whom the land is a gift of God, so apparently only they belong there, and even a sacred space with which they must interact in order to maintain their identity and values, LS 146. The German-speaking religious nationalist Artgemeinschaft could not have formulated it any better. The follow-up encyclical Fratelli Tutti, 2020, continues in the same vein. Love of one's neighbor, misunderstood as love of a foreign culture, is, absurdly, made dependent on one's own firm rootedness in one's own country, on one's attachment to one's own people and their culture, LS 143. One must love one's country and its people with their respective cultural characteristics, and must never harbor a grudge against one's own people. The history of one's own place is a gift from God. Then openness to the universal is only empty and superficial, is flight or uprooting, LS 145. As if that were not precisely what Christians, with their tendency towards the transcendent, should strive for, because the universal must not be the predominance of a single form of culture, LS 144. What else, then? Apparently a world in which nothing but indigenous people, who preserve their ancestral roots and cultures, are in dialogue with each other, LS 148, presumably about their incredibly important peculiarities and differences, which are said to have something to do with love of one's neighbor. Not people, but cultures are capable of dialogue for Francis. It is also permissible to enrich oneself with elements of foreign origin, provided that this is not simply a shameful act of copying, a cultural appropriation, but that a new synthesis, filling the world with new beauty, is created, in which the cultures, i.e. the homogeneous peoples, make the new their own in their own way, LS 148. Whatever this empty phrase is supposed to mean, universal is not the ideal of how people should interact with their environment, but the conviction that one should behave differently from the others depending on one's alleged nature. For the propagators of contextualizing missions, traditional Christianity is only one possible variant, adapted to Jewish culture. In other cultural contexts, it could take on completely different content. Each nation should therefore decide for itself what Christianity, if it is accepted, means for them in concrete terms. Classical mission was not contextualizing, but knew that it is precisely the context of the respective heathens, their cultural environment, that keeps them away from the Christian God. For the progressives in today's church, however, the communication of theological teachings has become irrelevant. Mission should simply lead to more community spirit, making you a better community member. You no longer address individuals who then break away from the cozy secular community, but nations. Accordingly, Francis was not too proud to explicitly call on Chinese Catholics in 2023 to be good citizens, just as state harassment of religion was reaching new heights, with priests and bishops who were not registered in the State Patriotic Association being imprisoned and otherwise persecuted. In 2024, a new law was even presented in Hong Kong, according to which priests are obliged to report high treason, crimes confessed in confession to the authorities. It can be assumed that spies will test the law-abiding behavior of the clergy in feigned confessions. In the same year, in the midst of the Russian nationalist war of aggression against a country that is not insignificantly Catholic in character, he addressed Russian Catholics, who are Russian in their own way, as heirs of the Great Mother Russia, heirs of the Great Russia of Peter the Great and Catherine II, whose legacy, of great culture etc., must be continued at all costs. His bizarre enthusiasm for Russia may well be linked to the specific history of the order, as the Jesuits owe their survival during the period of Prohibition from 1773 to 1814 to the Tsarist educational policy. The subjugation of national cultures and sensitivities is logically accompanied by the abolition of general morality and legality. The controversial Vatican document Fiducia Supplicans on the blessing of couples in irregular relationships, 2023, for example, places great emphasis on avoiding scandal and confusion among the faithful, FS 30+39. Whether or not the church blessings mentioned in the text are carried out depends on the subjective sensitivities of the local community. The decisive factor is not the objective goodness or badness of an act, but the opinion of the respective community or even nation. This is rapidly accelerating the disintegration of the church. Cardinal Ambongo, president of the Symposium of African Episcopal Conferences, has already defended the rejection of the corresponding blessings in Africa with reference to the unspeakable Chapter 19 of the summary of the first session of the Synodality Synod. Episcopal conferences and continental sections are to protect the culture of the peoples, so that uniformity and centralism do not arise again in the Church, defended the rejection of the corresponding blessings in Africa. The accusation of cultural colonization by the West was of course also not missing. According to the motto, Africans have a homophobic culture, which must be accepted in Europe, but in Europe, of course, a different moral applies, so a homo blessing is okay there. It would be completely wrong to see a weakness in Rome in the acceptance of the African non-implementation of Fiducia Supplicans, or even the German rejection of basically everything that comes from Rome, as a FAZ commentator did. For Francis, such inequality, which is based on ethnic and cultural boundaries, is perfectly acceptable. He deliberately abolishes the relevance of his office and wants a church that is decentralized in every respect. His church does not teach, it listens. The Letter to the People of God, which was written in the context of the Synod and published at the end of October 2023, also lectures that the church must in future listen more, for example, to the poor, to young people, to indigenous peoples, those groups, that is, which the wealthy old white men who are behind the letter in a fit of projection have completely different concerns than those that are understood by the evil conservatives in the church as general human concerns, namely the struggle for the eternal salvation of the soul, which must be fought equally by all. Enlightened theologians, shaped by a deterministic worldview and the elimination of religion, long for more salvation in the midst of profane history, which must have more meaning beyond the constant expansion of the host of saints. In particular, a monant goal, a perfection, even an age of the Holy Spirit, as Joachim of Fiore had already expected in the 12th century, whose teachings were condemned as heresies, although his ideal of poverty is very close to the Bergoglian image of the Church. Later, radical Protestantism, especially in Pietism, then, in a secularized version, the German Enlightenment, for example, in Lessing, who assumed an ascending model of historical ages. The latter, as newly discovered actors in history, focused on the nations, the counterimage to the Church, which has already found its salvation, the earthly society that is still waiting for its own liberation. For German idealism, especially in the work of Schelling and Hegel, God unfolds in the world through the world itself. Things emerge from him as if of their own accord. This world may have fallen away from its divine archetype, but it returns to it in history, regaining the lost unity. Schelling explicitly referred to the doctrine of the ages of Joachim of Fiore, the Johannine age, the third kingdom without a church hierarchy, but with pure reason would realize the heavenly Jerusalem on earth, in which Judaism and paganism would stand side by side on an equal footing. This immanent image of God, as essentially shared by Karl Rahner, one of the most important council theologians, makes the world a place of realized salvation, which should concretely consist in the intimate unity of peacefully coexisting, folkloristic, enlightened peoples, untroubled by any confessional dispute. For this, a new Pentecost was needed. This term, which downgrades the old Pentecost, was already used by John XXIII, who convened the last council, which would bear fruit especially in the universal dialogue. Through Christ's act of salvation, the whole world was actually already filled with the divine, which only had to be teased out in each person to develop, preferably with the help of the respective people's own spiritual tradition. Since God is behind everything that happens, according to the consequent Protestant foundation of the modern ecumenical movement, long since expanded to include all the spiritual traditions of the world, people of other religions could not really be wrong. What kind of spirit is it that is supposed to bring the new Pentecost, which unites humanity by leading it to abandon its awareness of ideological contradictions? Certainly not the same one that traditional Christians regard as the Holy Spirit, who, among other things, is gifted in discerning the spirits. There are already many more similarities with Hegel's monistic world spirit, which in turn is said to be at work in the various people's spirits as subjects of history. But it gets worse. In March 2024, Francis met with the German spiritual best-selling author Anselm Grun, whom he praised for his work and encouraged to continue. Grun, who learned Zen meditation from the ex-Nazi cultist Durkheim, with the less Christian goal of self-discovery and reconnection to one's own essence, is a pantheist. For him, God is energy that flows in everything. Christ is no longer even a redeemer, but a scholar, no different from Buddha. God has always worked redemption, even in other religions, through their wisdom, Jewish Christian doctrine denying the character of God's exclusive self-revelation. Grun is a prime example of Francis's approach of incarnating Christianity in a foreign culture, in this case, the New Age movement, and of the inevitable failure of this approach, because all that remains of Christianity is terminology. Their astrological concept of the age of the ram, the sacrificial animal of the Old Testament, ended with the birth of Christ, that of the Pisces. The Church began, only to be replaced 2,000 years later by that of the Aquarius. Also partly refers to the Joachimian concept of the Johannine age of brotherly love, a collective improvement of humanity in wisdom and justice, which closes the circle of Christian esotericism of the Green Brand. The points of Francis' polyhedron, the cultures, are, as it were, beauties formed by the world spirit. What is should be, and this realization is an expression of being completely filled with the Spirit. The Bishop of Rome's completely tradition-defying understanding of universalism is explained by his background as an Argentinian Jesuit. His deeply rooted anti-Western prejudices characterize his view of culture and what endangers it. Since the 19th century, Argentina has been dominated by a completely unbridled nationalism that, in the absence of national specifics, was primarily constructed by creating a common enemy image, that is, the evil exploiter. At that time, cosmopolitanism and imperialism were the great bogeymen of the Montoneras, and the populist left-wing fascist Peronism then wanted to create justice in the 20th century. It was clear to everyone, from the left and the right, that the exploiting states of Great Britain and the USA, both controlled by Jewish financial interests, would oppress the third world countries just as the evil rootless rich would oppress the poor within their own beloved homeland, who, from a vulgar Christian perspective, were glorified as saints and the true people. After the temporary fall of the Perón regime, the forces that saw themselves as progressive remained loyal to their leader. The first to refer to the historic Montoneros were the pro-Nazi and extremely anti-Semitic Taquara guerrillas of José Baxter. A little later, the leaders of the left-wing guerrillas calling themselves Montoneros emerged from this group, who maintained close ties with liberation theologians and the priest association Movimiento de Sacerdotes para el Tercer Mundo, which was founded in 1967, and the newspaper Cristianismo y Revolución, and worked towards the return of their leader. In the opinion of many Jewish Argentinians, the anti-imperialist left-wing forces of that time were just as radical in their hatred of Jews as the right-wingers. Rodolfo Walsh, one of the many Montoneros with a strong fascist background, built up a news agency for Che Guevara, Homeland or Death, published a report on Palestine in 1974 that was full of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, and is now considered a left-wing martyr because he was murdered by the military junta in 1977. The most important political publicist of those days was Juan José Hernández Arregui, who in 1960 philosophized about the emergence of national consciousness and was a source of ideas for the Montoneros. North American imperialism was the worst in the world. The internal enemy was the internationally active, denationalized Jews who dominated the financial and economic system. In this climate, Jorge Bergoglio had to position himself as the country's Jesuit provincial. Who were the popular voices in the church in South America at that time? One of the most influential liberation theologians was the left-wing Peronist Enrique Dussel, who turned away from his idol in 1973, a disappointment for his Peronist colleague Bergoglio, who remained loyal to him. Dussel was an Argentinian with German ancestors who, during the council, worked as a research assistant to the Nazi-friendly ecumenist Joseph Lortz in Germany. In his work, it is hardly surprising that the dependence of certain peoples on someone or other is declared to be the root of all evil, and nationalism and national independence, in every sense, are glorified. In the thinking of liberation theology, commitment to the poor is not possible without nationalism and anti-imperialism, due to the false analogy by which individuals are inferred from nations. And in Bergoglio's order itself, from 1965 to 1981, the Basque Pedro Arup was the general of the Jesuits. He had studied in the 1930s at progressive universities in the Netherlands and Belgium and was close to the theology of Karl Reimers. The world was already reconciled in truth, it just had to realize it through the missionaries, and then delight in this happy liberal Protestant message in a hippie-like swaying mood. Arup had already declared at the council that Catholic missions must integrate ancient cultures. The materialistic, fused culture of modernity was soulless, the culture of real Christians not superior. In 1977, at a South American synod, he called for enculturation, saying that no one should be forced to accept a foreign culture. Faith would merely purify and teach an existing culture. He agreed with Rahner that other religions had redeeming elements and were ultimately part of God's plan. The Church had to identify with local cultures, incarnate itself in them, and become particularized, and it was precisely in this way that its universality would be demonstrated. The Church should no longer have a culture-forming effect. The existing cultures were without exception good and God-willed. In Arup's eyes, Catholic Universalism was no longer about giving everyone the same thing, but about taking from everyone and giving to everyone, since everything was already anonymous Christianity. Bergoglio himself organized a conference on the topic of the evangelization of culture and the inculturation of the gospel as early as 1985, on the occasion of the 400th anniversary of the Jesuits' presence in Argentina. That order, once the very embodiment of Roman centralism, had in the 20th century, of all things, elevated the syncretism-promoting aspects of its own history, which had once been rejected by Rome, to a particularly central tradition. In December 2022, Matteo Ricci, the instigator of the Chinese rights controversy, was declared venerable by Francis, which fits in with the Holy See's defeatist policy towards China. For several years now, the Sinicization of religion has been rigorously enforced there for the purpose of rational unity and religious harmony. In the 16th century, the order was still dominated by the realization that Christianity was not compatible with the ideas prevailing in Asia. A personal God, especially one who allows people freedom to do evil, was something completely foreign there. These morbidly anti-imperialist traits of South American Catholicism in the post-conciliar era still characterize the Church there today and ruthlessly destroy the old unity that transcended ethnicities, for which precisely that continent was once so admired by cosmopolitan Catholics. In Mexico, too, the local bishops' conference now wants to introduce its own liturgical elements, such as dances, for indigenous people. In 2023, a complete syncretic Mayan rite with pre-Christian elements was tested. According to Cardinal Arizmendi Esquivel, this has nothing to do with folklore and is not a clerical invention of an indigenous rite. His vehement rejection makes the opposite even clearer, but rather that they simply want to integrate the ways in which these peoples relate to God into the liturgy. Respect for ancient paganism, Catholicism is no longer universal. An appropriate anecdote: in May 2023, the Vatican withdrew a special postage stamp after a few days that showed Francis in the place of Henry the Navigator on the Monument of Discoveries in Lisbon. Bishop Depinho Moreira Azevedo, delegate of the Pontifical Committee for Historical Sciences, found that such a thing contradicts universal brotherhood. However, it is thanks to the discoverers that the Church found millions of people who did not yet know the Jewish Redeemer, which it boasts of bringing. How can there be universal brotherhood when one does not only not understand the other, but, due to the lack of discoverers, would never have gotten to know him? Who should strive for universal brotherhood if he has not been taught the existence of universal values, as classical Christianity, in contrast to ethnic religions, postulates? The aforementioned historian also told the millions of Catholic half-breeds in Latin America, with his condemnation of the discovery of the Americas, that it was regrettable that they existed, and that it would be better if their countries were populated only by pure-blooded, pagan tribes that lived as primitively as possible. With so much idealization of ethnic tribal churches, it seems that Rome is ignoring the fact that the worst oppression of Christians in Latin America today is precisely the result of the model of tribal society, which has once again become fashionable. The postmodern division of a society that was previously under one law has led to a situation there that is unworthy of human beings, in that within the indigenous communities, which are once again to be sealed off from the rest of society, their own quasi-authorities and tribal leaders have built up a separate, law system in which the preservation of their own identity has top priority. Mission is of course forbidden there, and anyone who gives up the religious or cultural practices of the tribe is de facto considered to be without rights. The indigenous institutions impose penalties, and those affected cannot defend themselves against them with the help of the state courts, since the latter respect the own jurisdiction of those totalitarian groups to whom autonomy is granted. Freedom of religion does not exist for those people who are categorized as indigenous. In Mexico, e.g. Chiapas, Yucatan and elsewhere, Christian indigenous people have their children taken away if they leave the community's faith, and in Cauca, Colombia, a case in 2022 caused a stir when indigenous people were whipped for spreading Christian teachings. Such conditions should be condemned in the strongest terms by the Church, which claims to be committed to human rights. Instead, it comes up with empty phrases about the context and preaches the anti-universalistic pseudo-universalism described above, a polyhedral humanity that is sometimes dripping with blood. One thing is clear: a Holy Spirit is definitely not at work here. Sarah Atesh always just wanted to belong to the Kreuzberg left-wing scene, to the squatters in East Berlin, the feisty lawyers, the feminists. She did not find the warmth she was looking for in a place where she could let herself go and take the notorious vacation from herself, and she did not find her true identity there either. Although she was able to make a name for herself in her red-green German environment due to her Turkish background, which she did thoroughly and even received the Federal Cross of Merit for her efforts towards integration, little came of it for her own searching soul. Those who, like her, had ties to the now-defunct Turkey of the 1980s and 1990s could not hope for harmony, but were automatically confronted with bitterly fought battles and constantly forced to take part in heated discussions. The path to the longed-for great community was thus closed to her. The German friends had only non-committal esoteric religious substitutes to offer, and as long as the intellectuals in Turkey and in the diaspora were exclusively negotiating a better society under the sign of atheism, there was nothing for her there either. So she remained the unhappy critic that she did not want to be, and so she felt not only alone, abandoned and insignificant, but above all excluded from a community that had reconciled itself with itself and the world, which she had attacked with all her might in 2009. Quote, "Instead of questioning the oppressive authorities in Islam, many young Muslims fight the West. They project their hatred and anger onto it, feelings that they forbid themselves to have towards their own people. They prefer to fight the battle with arguments that are put forward vicariously with another authority rather than with their actual opponents. Their upbringing is so based on fear that they lack the courage to resist the older generation. The danger of being excluded from the Ummah, the community, is great. And without the Ummah, the Muslim is alone, abandoned, meaningless. But this fight against the West will not free young people from the shackles that their own society and religion impose on them." End of quote. This analysis of the hopeless Islamic violence of the critic Atesh must have been in contradiction to the budding hopes of the seeker of meaning Atesh to become part of exactly this fascinatingly binding community. For it was not only in her 2017 book Salam, Frau Mammon, that the feminist asserted her right to belong to this Ummah in a mixture of demands and pleas. Quote, "I do not want to be excluded from the Ummah, the great community of Muslims. It even annoys me very much when some people think I am not a Muslim, so I don't belong. End of quote. For at least 2 years, Atesh, who now works as an imam at the self-proclaimed liberal Ibn Rushd Girda Mosque, has been publicly presenting herself mainly as a devout Muslim, thereby serving the desire of the German majority society and the Erdogan regime to declare Islam to be a racial characteristic of all Turks, regardless of the faith they practice. For where devout Muslim women are, paradoxically, placed alongside non-believers, lifelong membership of a collective from which one cannot withdraw applies. Ms. Atesh apparently considers what 99% of the population is stamped into their Turkish passports, religious affiliation Islamic, to be legitimate. The only thing that Ms. Atesh continues to renounce is the self-ascribed title of Muslim. The ending on the letter A, which lacks any grammatical logic but is used worldwide as a symbol of a modern Islam that has regained its self-confidence, bundles the ethnic dignity of the Islamic woman in the role intended for her within the gender-apart Ummah. But in reality, the devout Muslim Atesh and her liberal Islam are never able to displace the bigoted Muslims who represent the modern, i.e. ultimately Islamist Islam, and their identitarian mission. Eight's turning to Islam seems to have been determined by a decidedly anti-national reorientation of the Ummah, which, according to a survey by the American Jewish Committee, is increasingly causing irritation at Berlin schools. Teachers who have been at their schools for longer speak of a shift in self-identification of many students away from their ethnicity and towards their religion. Tagesspiegel, July 19, 2017. Of course, Atesh is far from being an Islamist or anti-Semitic zealot, and yet the feminist of Turkish and Kurdish origin, and staunch opponent of headscarves to this day, is defenseless against the imposition of precisely this shift. In 2009, in her polemic "The Islam Needs a Sexual Revolution," she had still described the Ummah as the actual opponent and fetter from which it was necessary to free oneself, but now liberation is to come about, of all things, through the totalitarian custodial institution for women and girls, which no longer needs to be abolished but only reformed. Atesh, who in 2003 in her autobiography Großreis ins Führt die Gestricht einer Deutschen Türkin, Great Journey into Fire, the Story of a German Turk, which is not free of self-culturalization, reported with disgust that at a left-wing educational event she helped organize on violence in Turkish and Kurdish groups, one of the men present addressed us as sisters. It must fill her with pride today when she is addressed as sister. Seren. Instead of opposing the omnipresent identitarian delusion as a prerequisite for critical thinking, Atesh turns social need into a sought-after virtue and stages herself as the friendly face of a totalitarian ideology. She, who almost instinctively recognizes the extortionate imposition that lies in the word sister, who has experienced how seemingly friendly, but in reality cruel, the identitarian coercive collective assigns its role to women who are supposed to belong to the migrant counterrace, has internalized, on behalf of many, particularly migrant critics, what a theory production, largely probably unknown to her, provided her with seemingly critical, in reality identitarian, somehow sisterly. Keywords: the attack on the individual, whose public and private existence is only tolerated in the corset of socially recognized identities, took place ideologically from the mid-1970s, when the implosion of the social milieus of workers and employees began and answers were sought. It was during this period that Jean-François Lyotard's best-selling book The Postmodern Condition and his book The Patchwork of Minorities, which already foreshadowed the entire ideological program in its title, were published. Lyotard was delighted to note, "This movement of fragmentation affects not only nations, but also societies. Important new groups are emerging that have not been listed in the official registers so far. Women, homosexuals, divorcees, prostitutes, dispossessed, guest workers. The more the categories multiply, the more complicated and unwieldy their centralized administration becomes. Then the tendency grows to take matters into one's own hands, without passing through all the mediations of the center, or to cynically short-circuit them, as in the case of hostage-taking." End of quote. The alleged revaluation of collective groupings and categories, which in reality was already based on the devaluation of individuation, whether of women, homosexuals, etc., could only succeed if the capitalist class character was denied as a basic condition of the post-Fordist mode of production. The conditions for social culturalization were created not only ideologically, but increasingly also in practice, and this has now led to a decentralized form of rule with totalitarian traits that does not tolerate anyone who insists on their individual uniqueness instead of subordinating themselves to their collective. Much of what Lyotard still dreamed of in The Patchwork of Minorities is already a reality today. Quote, Struggles are struggles of minorities that want to remain minorities and be recognized as such. They say yes to a different space that consists of a patchwork of laws and customs. Today we say cultures, without a center. End of quote. A good example of this culturalist patchwork thinking can be found in the current study by the Bertelsmann Foundation, Muslims in Europe, Integrated but Not Accepted. The authors of the study claim, against all empirical evidence, that identification with the host country is strongly pronounced, while the frequently cited Muslim parallel society is the exception rather than the rule. Rather, the majority of Muslim immigrants, at least since the second generation, have arrived in the center of our society. If there are any obstacles to integration, they are to be found in the majority society, where these integration efforts are not recognized everywhere. End of quote. Neither intentional falsification nor crude spin doctoring are the cause of such madness. The authors of the Bertelsmann study have internalized the thinking in centerless patchwork and minority dimensions along Lyotardian lines to such an extent that the result is at least an ideological gain for the borderless post-national Germany. The study thus professes a concept of social integration that would have led to the current reality of many migrants having left the national framework to such an extent that social integration takes place in transnational contexts, in which questions of acculturation, placement, interaction, and identification must be posed quite differently. End of quote. The miserable reality of countless Muslim migrants, for whom the many self-proclaimed or already institutionalized communal religious watchdogs in this country make social integration in the national, i.e. social, rather than in the Ummah framework impossible, is thus glossed over as a preliminary stage of cosmopolitanism. The message is that those subjected to Islamization already live quite differently, namely transnationally, so that the majority society only needs to follow their social integration on the way to the inevitable fragmentation, Lyotard, of nation and society. The society that is no longer supposed to exist can do without a binding consensus anyway, the Bertelsmann executives continue. Furthermore, in culturally plural and socially unequal immigrant societies, the problem of the plausibility of mainstream assimilation arises, since a social mainstream here is only comprehensible as a statistical construct, but does not describe the concrete reality of life. The idea of such assimilation presupposes a leading culture that a majority of society can orient itself towards. In Western European societies, however, such a consensus is becoming increasingly difficult to recognize due to the development of different milieus. End of quote. Gilles Deleuze, who in the 1970s stirred up mistrust of a plausible social consensus in favor of a non-binding patchwork of minorities, and, with his partner Felix Guattari, discovered consensus-shattering rhizomes, multiplicities, micropolitics, and thousand plateaus, stated in his highly regarded postscript on control societies that with the end of Fordism, which he associated with the disciplinary society that had reached its end, the factory was replaced by the company. The service of sales has become the center or soul of the company. We are taught that companies have a soul, which is really the biggest horror story in the world. The lamented merging of production and reproduction led Deleuze to suspect that a new form of domination was emerging, which was concerned with proving the inability of trade unions. Throughout their history, they, the trade unions, were tied to the struggle in the enclosing environments or against discipline. Can they adapt to the new situation, or will they make way for new forms of resistance against the control societies? End of quote. Numerous of his disciples, with explicit reference to Deleuze, set about developing a contemporary form of resistance against post-Fordist control societies. In the 1996 book Mainstream der Minderheiten, Mainstream of Minorities, which collects contributions from so-called pop theorists and was edited by Mark Terkesidis and Tom Hollert, the foreword already contains a program that celebrates the culturalization of social conditions as a new form of resistance. In it, Terkesidis and Hollert correctly state that the spaces for criticism are becoming narrower because, with the victory over the disciplinary society, the system of categories for social self-description has been culturalized, and thus what could previously be interpreted economically and politically can now only be viewed through the lens of culture. However, instead of calling for a halt to this culturalization, they advocate a headlong rush forward. In diametric opposition to Adorno and Horkheimer, who opposed the rapidly declining autonomy of the self in the age of mass culture, the editors of Mainstream der Minderheiten postulate the accelerated farewell to the individuality of the individual as a contemporary form of social resistance. To describe this overaffirmation of the status quo, They introduce the concept of representation as the pre- and presentation of a thing in another medium, which they connect with the identitarian world of the place of speech, in which it is strictly frowned upon to take sides as an individual, but where it is strictly required to appear only as a representative of something that has previously become either one's own culture of origin or one's own collective affiliation, as an appendage and loudspeaker of which one has to dress up. Seyran Atesh may have only partially perceived the theoretical affirmation of a process that inevitably leads to the institutionalization of Islam as a supranational guiding culture. As a postmodern, culturalist ideologue, she has always been on the move, but for a long time she was also a feminist critic of Islam. With her self-culturalization as a devout Muslim, she has fully joined the mainstream of minorities in its totalitarian variant, while in the years before she had apparently devoted herself to more harmless forms of migrant self-discovery. As early as 2003, she presented herself in her autobiography Großreis ins Feuer as a proud patchworker. Quote, "As a migrant, I have learned to feel comfortable in many chairs. We sit here and there." End of quote. She did not want to present herself as a pathological case or as an unscrupulous and ultimately corrupt ideologue. Quite the opposite. She claims, in the style of kitschy social romanticism, that this back and forth between cultures is not a source of inner conflict. It does not lead us into constant conflict, but enriches our lives, without being able to satisfy her longing for belonging to a community that can no longer be questioned. She has found a special way to distance herself from the multicultural fallacy, the title of her book published in 2007, without renouncing the multicultural cause. In Der Multikulti-Irrtum, it reads like this: "I too was a supporter of multicultural society for a long time. Today I think that reality has overtaken this concept and that, without ever having utilized the possibilities of a multicultural society, we are on the way to a society that is more aptly described as transcultural." End of quote. Transculturality is also her very personal mantra, which she has been publicly reciting everywhere until today. Quote, "I am deeply convinced that many cultures, languages, and religions can live peacefully together, and that something wonderfully new is created when people internalize different cultures. To achieve this, they really have to live together. A real exchange must take place. Integration is only possible if it aims to create stable identities, if the majority society does not demand that people give up the culture of their country of origin, and if there are no parallel societies that fight the culture of the majority." End of quote. What the crucial difference to multiculturalism is here, and what should come out of it other than the patchwork of minorities, remains the well-kept secret of Seyran Atesh. The idea that the sum of cultures automatically produces something new, which is of course always wonderful and enriching, is old-school multicultural nonsense that Atesh has merely modernized in terms of language. It culminates, quite logically, in a dull identity hubbub that does not even stop her from reducing the cosmopolitan concept of the world citizen to a question of ethnic and cultural origin. Quote, "I have a Turkish-Kurdish-German identity, a transcultural identity that I like and that does not tear me apart, but makes me more open, a world citizen." End of quote. Atesh, too, is concerned not with overcoming, but with the confirmation and recognition, even the internalization of cultures of all kinds, and thus with the opposite of what Adorno outlined as the only reasonable utopia, namely to ensure a coexistence of the different over and above identity and contradiction. This would be decidedly different from the supposedly peaceful coexistence of many cultures, languages, and religions, and would be a union of individuals who want something better than the mutation of all people into Joe Normalabwich, Jürgen Kobe. Atesh is not and has never been outside the cross-party and cross-cultural consensus that extends from the critical whiteness seminar at the Humboldt University in Berlin to the AfD. Rather, she embodies a strong piece of ideological Germany in her own way, which then also leads to a consequent postmodern eclectic approach to the Quran instead of criticism of Islam. It is only logical that the new Imam Atesh only wants to take up the cudgels for a peaceful Islam, and continues to explain, "I believe in the loving, merciful Allah and in the positive example of Muhammad for all Muslims." No question, Seyran 85, who, as is well known, received countless death threats immediately after the founding of the Ibn Rushd Gurda Mosque and has had to live under police protection ever since, deserves solidarity and support from her enemies, who are also the enemies of every critic of Islam and who seek to harm her life and limb. But she does not dismiss the criticism that she not only belongs to the mainstream of minorities, but also works hard for it. With the founding of her mosque, She has done a disservice to those who are finally fed up with their minority culture and religion, who want to leave the communal prison behind in favor of an individual life, and who long for social support in their efforts. Seyran Atesh must accept the criticism voiced by her admirer Hülya Gala, who works as a certified pedagogue with immigrants, at the opening of the Ibn Rushd Gurda Mosque in the Taz. There is only one thing left to do: to give up the one-sided negative focus over the years and to look positively at the inner Muslim diversity and the strengths of Muslim communities. End of quote. The Almighty sits on his heavenly throne, holding a seven-sealed book in his hands. A slaughtered lamb with 7 horns and 7 eyes takes it from him. As it breaks the first 4 of the 7 seals, 4 horsemen appear one after the other, each on a white, a fiery red, a black, and a pale horse. They are given the power to kill with sword, famine, and wild beasts. The tongue-in-cheek title of the recording of their first joint discussion in 2007, chosen by Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Dan Dennett, and Christopher Hitchens, alludes to this vision in the Book of Revelation, the last book of the New Testament. The quartet united in their polemic not only against religious fundamentalism, but against religion in general, which they castigated as organized irrationalism in the name of enlightenment and scientific progress. For many years, the Dutch-American politician Ayaan Hirsi Ali was also considered a central figure in this movement, which became known as New Atheism. She grew up in Somalia, Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia, and Kenya, was raised as an Orthodox Muslim, and spent her youth in the environment of the Muslim Brotherhood, before escaping an impending forced marriage by entering the Netherlands illegally in the early 1990s. There she became an apostate and began to engage in political activity. As an uncompromising critic of Islam, she was not only exposed to accusations of Islamophobia, but also to a constant threat to her life and limb, which reached its climax after Theo van Gogh, with whom she had made the short film Submission, Part 1, about the position of women in Islam, was murdered by an Islamist in 2004. The assassin, a dual Dutch-Moroccan national born in Amsterdam, had pinned a note with a death threat to Hirsi Ali to the victim's clothing. She was forced to go into hiding. The price she paid for formulating her blasphemy in an open and decisive confrontation with Islam, instead of cloaking herself in the darkness of the vulgar materialistic night, in which all religions are equally gray, distinguished Hirsi Ali from the outset from anti-theists of the ilk of the biologist Richard Dawkins. Nevertheless, there was a proximity to the 4 horsemen. They were guests on the same YouTube channels and appeared together at conferences such as the Global Atheist Convention, where Dawkins gave Hirsi Ali the nickname 5th Horsewoman in 2012. The reactions in this spectrum were correspondingly irritated when the Islam critic announced in November 2023 that she had converted to Christianity. In an essay entitled Why I Am Now a Christian, which is modeled on Bertrand Russell's famous essay Why I Am Not a Christian, she explained her reasons for this decision. With the expansionist authoritarianism of Russia and China, the rise of global Islamism, and the woken ideology, liberal Western states are facing 3 related enemies, both internal and external. For Hirsi Ali, the fact that the West is at least weakening on all these fronts is explained at least in part by a rampant lack of orientation with regard to the question of what holds it together at its core. The response that God is dead seems insufficient, says Hirsi Ali, and continues, so, too, does the attempt to find solace in the rules-based liberal international order. The only credible answer, I believe, lies in our desire to uphold the legacy of the Judeo-Christian tradition. Hirsi Ali wants this Judeo-Christian heritage to be understood as an ensemble of ideas and institutions for the protection of human life, human freedom, and dignity. From the nation-state and the rule of law to the institutions of science, health, and learning. Secularization as a condition for the possibility of these modern institutions has essentially taken place in and through Christianity, and not against it. Unlike Islam, Christianity outgrew its dogmatic stage. In diametric opposition to the historical interpretation of her former neo-atheist allies, who never tire of painting a picture of how modern freedoms were won in bloody battles against Christian orthodoxy, Hirsi Ali sees the Church as the forerunner of liberalism, which first prepared the ground for it. In doing so, Hirsi Ali is following in the footsteps of a well-known predecessor, albeit not explicitly. In 1942, Benedetto Croce published an essay entitled Perch non possiamo non dirsi Christiani, Why We Cannot Help But Call Ourselves Christians, which can also be interpreted as an allusion to Russell's essay. Croce, a scholar of Vico and Hegel and a leading figure in the liberal tradition of the Risorgimento, explains here, in contrast to some of his earlier writings, the rise of Christianity as the greatest revolution ever achieved by humankind. All other human innovations are either inferior to it or, like the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the French Revolution, dependent on it. In doing so, he does not regard what occurred in the first century, first in Galilee and Judea and then throughout the Roman Empire, as a divine act of salvation, but as a profound change in the consciousness of mankind, which created the basis for the realization of the idea of freedom in history over the centuries. This cultural avowal of Croce's, not to Christ but to Christianity, must be understood against the background of his resolute rejection of fascism and Nazi barbarism. The fact that Croce does not even hint at this connection in his 1942 text, but instead praises the civilizing blessings of Christianity with a remarkable lack of concern, indicates that his concept of history only includes those events that contribute to the development of the principle of freedom. In doing so, Croce places fascism and Nazism as it were as footnotes outside the historical text, which purposefully led from Jesus to the Risorgimento and finally to the First Republic of 1946. The question of whether the conditions for the possibility of fascism are inherent in liberalism itself does not arise for him. This blind spot points to the inconsistency of the liberal belief in Christianity. If the values of Christianity that are worth preserving have completely migrated into the profane sphere, or if, conversely, secular liberalism is the highest stage of the development of a morality of freedom rooted in the teachings of Jesus, then it is not clear why it is necessary to return to its Christian origins. In this case, it would be a matter of intellectual honesty to recall the religious origins of modern institutions and forms of thought, but this reference would lack the urgency with which Hirsi Ali and, in a different way, Benedetto Croce present it. If, on the other hand, as in the case of Hirsi Ali, the insistence on preserving a specifically Christian heritage of the West is motivated by reference to a crisis in secular Western societies, then, if this crisis is not to be simply bracketed out of a linear process of progress, we will have to consider the possibility that something essential was lost with the Enlightenment liberation from the religious yoke. Is the modern age really the bearer of a torch that it has taken over from the Christian Middle Ages, or does it owe its existence to a break with this, the consequences of which have not really been reflected upon to this day? This question of the moment of discontinuity in the process of secularization should be asked by anyone who recalls the particular origins of Western Universalism, even at the risk of jeopardizing cherished liberal certainties. However, instead of enabling the self-assurance that Hirsi Ali is obviously aiming for, the undertaking would then take on the character of an additional self-doubt. Unlike Croce, who leaves no doubt that he sees himself as an atheist defender of a Christianity measured by human standards, Hirsi Ali claims that she has experienced life without any comfort from above as unbearable, almost self-destructive, and has come to the conclusion that the question of the meaning of life cannot be answered without God. However, this reference to the personal dimension of her conversion remains so vague that the only thing that is ultimately interesting is what Hirsi Ali does not say here and does not say anywhere else in the text: that she believes in the life, death, and resurrection of God's only begotten Son, Jesus Christ. This gap, which, contrary to its declared intention, nevertheless brings the text close to a Croce, became the subject of a minor controversy on the fringes of the public debate. While, paradoxically, it was mainly her former fellow campaigners from the New Atheism movement who accused Hirsi Ali of not having genuinely converted, but merely of using Jewish Christian values as a weapon in a political conflict, Hirsi Ali's Christian advocates, more humanistic in this respect than the self-proclaimed humanists on the other side, explained that conversion is not a total transformation overnight, but rather a process that often takes years, and that no one can be blamed for being at the beginning of this process. And anyway, inquisitorial zeal is not appropriate when dealing with the souls of our fellow human beings. In this dispute, however, the underlying assumption of Hirsi Ali's explanation, that Christianity in its present form A, embodies the desire to maintain the Judeo-Christian tradition and B, serves as a weapon in the conflict with the aforementioned internal and external opponents of the West, was hardly questioned. Or, to put it more succinctly, is it at all legitimate to rely on Christianity as an authority for the defense of the West? Addressing this question is made more difficult by the fact that Hirsi Ali has remained silent about her newly acquired religious affiliation. If a conversion is made primarily on the basis of political considerations, one would think that the real political and theological constitution of the institution to which one professes allegiance would play a decisive role in these considerations. Which form of Christianity, to put the question more precisely, can today legitimately be called upon to defend the West? This is what we will be looking at below, with reference to Christianity in both the Old and the New World. It is no secret that, In the case of the Protestant Reformed churches of Western Europe, such an appeal would be unrealistic. If these churches, and the EKD in particular, have been working hard for years to align the interpretation of the Holy Scripture as closely as possible with the statutes of average non-governmental organizations close to the government, this is not only politically damaging, but also obscures the possibility of an institutionally framed religious return. The moments of the Christian heritage that are not absorbed into activist discourses are of genuine interest. By occupying this heritage as comprehensively as possible with contemporary buzzwords, official Protestant Christianity is leaving little room in its ranks for a struggle with transcendence mediated by revelation. This is not a new phenomenon, but rather the radicalization of a tendency that has long existed in Protestantism. In a short but extremely incisive lecture, Karl Barth once criticized 19th-century Protestant theology for having lost sight of its own questions and problems in its efforts to assert itself in the debate with modernity. He found so much to think about and discuss, under the doors and windows that were open to the outside world, that he hardly had time, love, or desire left for the work to be done inside the house. And yet, the winds blowing in from outside were not only fresh, but also extremely unpleasant winds. Today, the question arises as to whether the walls of the house are still standing, whether it still makes sense to distinguish between the inner life of Protestant theology and its external environment. The erosion of its autonomy, the same could be said of science in general and art, is due to the increasingly totalitarian-seeming expansion of an activist state apparatus into all areas of life, and at the same time it encourages it. By constantly encouraging individuals in churches, schools, and universities to think freely without regard to authority, we are producing subjects who, precisely because they know no law, are willing to comply with every new regulation, as in the Corona era. Protestant theology is therefore not only unsuitable as a remedy for the crisis in the West, but is itself included in the symptomatic processes. This is evident, for example, from the fact that Annette Kirschus, then chairwoman of the EKD, announced at the Synod in November 2023 that Jews in Germany should not have the slightest doubt that they can count on the churches, while at the same time and in the same breath demanding that anti-Muslim resentment must be resisted at all costs. She continued, "After my recent statements on migration, I have received countless letters that essentially say, you want to let masses of people into the country who are inciting hatred against Jews here? Shame on you." In this way, shameless hatred of Muslims is disguised as pro-Israel sentiment. In reality, it is pure racism, and our faith compels us to speak out very clearly against it. End of quote. The recent statements on migration, to which she refers, were made by Kirschus in an interview with the FAZ at the end of October. Among other things, she said, "Is there a limit to our capacity to accept refugees? From the perspective of charity, this limit is reached when we give up our own identity. I believe that we are still a long way from reaching this limit." End of quote. A little semantic sophistry is recommended to clarify the implications of this statement. If they are to serve to prevent self-abandonment, limits must be set long before the point of self-abandonment is reached. On the other hand, the fact that, according to Kirschus, only this point should mark the limit of absorption capacity can be translated into the demand to accept refugees until they abandon themselves. And indeed, the signs of the times point in this direction. In the 4 months since Kirschus's FAZ interview, a Mexican tourist in Munich was attacked by a group of 6 German, Eritrean, Syrian, and Yemeni nationals because he was wearing a kippah. A woman and a man who were speaking Hebrew in a fast food restaurant in Neukölln were spat at, attacked with a chair, and punched in the face by an Arab-speaking man. The Jewish student Lahav Shapira, who had spoken out against anti-Israel sentiment at the Free University of Berlin, was brutally beaten by an Arab student at a chance encounter in Berlin-Mitte. In Zurich, an Orthodox Jew was stabbed by a naturalized youth of Tunisian origin who had professed allegiance to the IS in a video. It can be assumed that these events will not change Kirschus' assessment, as it is her unshakable faith that forces her to brand the connection between Muslim immigration and the concrete threat to Jews in Europe as a racist fantasy. The Catholic Church's attitude towards migration policy and Islam is similar. When Pope Francis calls for a wide range of legal and regular entry options to Europe and warns that the main criterion for this should not be the preservation of one's own prosperity, but rather the preservation of human dignity, his choice of words is indistinguishable from those of an EKD Council chairwoman. This development is by no means new, despite the legacy of Pope Benedict, who had found clear words in view of the danger of global Islamism not only in his Regensburg lecture, the Council's Declaration Nostra Aetate, adopted in October 1965, set the course for a new attitude of the Church towards Islam. The original plan was to issue a declaration exclusively on the relationship between the Church and Judaism, which would address Christian antisemitism and lay the foundation for overcoming it. A plan that, when it became public, was interpreted in the Arab states by both Christians and Muslims as a confession of the Church's support for the State of Israel and as an unjustified favoring of the Jews, which led to fierce protests. What followed was a protracted struggle over the declaration, with the bishops' conferences of the Global South, some of which had already been decolonized and some of which were in the process of being decolonized, speaking out against what they perceived as the Church's one-sided Western focus. In the end, a consensus was reached on a projection that addressed Judaism in the context of a discussion of non-Christian religions and treated Islam separately. The declaration shows emblematically how the attempt to do justice to the self-image as an all-encompassing church and thus to the claim to the all-encompassing reason turns into relativism and political negligence. When it says at the most remarkable place of the text, the Church rejects nothing that is true and holy in these religions, meaning all religions spread throughout the world is a papal anything goes. And when the section on Islam combines the declared high regard for Muslims with the assurance that the Church wants to work for peace and freedom for all people. This indicates that its emphatic concept of humanity has repeatedly led the Church in recent times to a global ethic of not only loving one's neighbor but also loving one's enemy, which is given precisely to those who want nothing to do with the former. A symbolic example of this is the veiling of the naked statues in the Capitoline museums in Rome, which was declared a gesture of respect when the Iranian President Rouhani visited the Pope in 2016. Pope Francis' Easter call for a #ceasefire now in Gaza and his recommendation to Ukraine to lay down its arms, which was not only based on political or humanitarian considerations but also a plea for strength that would be authenticated by the courage to wave the white flag, are further examples of how the morality of the Sermon on the Mount has been transformed into defeatism. Although it is difficult to estimate the number of members of the churches mentioned who regularly shake their heads at the activities of their spiritual leaders, all in all, Europe has become accustomed to the pro-Islamic positions of the largest churches as a matter of course. Accordingly, there is a great deal of astonishment in this country about the situation on the other side of the Atlantic. At the latest since the 2016 presidential election, the evangelicals, who are considered to be a significant voting group for Trump, have been discovered as an ideal projection surface for anti-American and anti-Christian resentment. We don't know much about their history, their theological profile, or their political influence, but we are familiar with the images of protests outside abortion clinics and agree that these people represent a danger to democracy in the USA. The success of journalist Annika Brockschmidt, who published a bestseller in 2021 with the sensational title America's God Warriors, How the Christian Right is Endangering Democracy, and followed it up in January of the election year 2024 with The Arsonists, How Extremists Took Over the Republican Party, is based on this widely shared gut feeling. By tirelessly emphasizing the diversity, that is, the indeterminacy and indeterminability of the Christian right, Brockschmidt relieves herself of the task of elaborating on real religious and political lines of development in the United States. Instead, her book has the character of a collage of disliked quotations. The normative unassailability of a left-liberal consensus on pandemic policy, climate, Islam, migration, and gender is tacitly assumed. In the author's view, anyone who expresses a different opinion is in cahoots and forms the conspiracy of Christian nationalism, which is characterized by racism, hostility towards women and the queer community, and a theocratic understanding of politics. It is undeniable that all these tendencies can be found at least on the fringes of neo-evangelicalism and the religious right. Instead of approaching them with analytical means, however, Brockschmidt consistently uses the means of suggestion. Whenever her protagonists do not correspond to the image of the fanatical white supremacist, she takes this as evidence that the movement is trying to present a friendly face to the outside world, and diagnoses an encrypted version of Christian nationalism, which can be recognized, for example, by the emphasis on Judeo-Christian values. Ayaan Hirsi Ali would therefore have already qualified as a Christian nationalist, with the explanation of her conversion. Among the accusations that Brockschmidt levels against the Christian right, Islamophobia is not to be missed. It is substantiated as follows. Jerry Falwell, one of the most influential evangelical televangelists for decades, called Muhammad a terrorist on television in 2002, a statement that caused a diplomatic scandal and even led to riots in India, in which 5 people died. Quote end. The suggestion that these deaths were the fault of Falwell rather than the oversensitive prophet's disciples is ludicrous. However, Brockschmidt is right in saying that leading evangelicals have repeatedly attracted attention in recent decades with critical to polemical statements about Islam. This is only logical, since they are also the most uncompromising supporters of the Israeli cause in America. In a statement of support published on October 11, 2023 and signed by numerous luminaries of American evangelicalism, it is stated unequivocally, since the inception of the modern state of Israel in 1948, Israel has faced numerous attacks, incursions, and violations of its national sovereignty. The Jewish people have long endured genocidal attempts to eradicate them and to destroy the Jewish state. These anti-Semitic, deadly ideologies and terrorist actions must be opposed. End of quote. These lines merely express what had been more or less uncontested American common sense for several decades, and yet they deserve to be mentioned separately at a time when, according to a survey, half of all 18 to 24-year-old Americans are in favor of putting an end to Israel and handing it over to Hamas, and support for Israel is also declining among young Republicans. Against this backdrop, it is essential to take a sober look at the history and present of the evangelicals as a political force when considering the possible role of Christianity in defending an increasingly fragile West. Evangelicalism has its roots in Pietism, Presbyterianism, and Puritanism, as well as in the interdenominational Protestant revival movements in the New World since the 1730s. However, there is much to suggest that the characteristics that are still typical of it today only began to emerge from the end of the 19th century. At that time, the so-called postmillennialism was widespread among followers of all Protestant denominations in the USA. Based on the 20th chapter of the Book of Revelation, it states that Jesus Christ will only return after 1,000 years of God's rule on earth, millennium. According to the followers of this eschatological doctrine, which is largely compatible with a liberal historical optimism, good will continue to spread throughout history and gradually triumph over evil, with the parousia, the return of Jesus, being the goal and end of this positive development within the secular age. The counterpart to this optimistic eschatology was premillenarianism, which was initially less popular. According to this doctrine, the second coming of Christ and the last days, with all their horrors, were to be expected before the establishment of his millennial kingdom and could therefore occur at any time. This view has its roots in the early church, but was rejected by Augustine and had completely lost its significance in the Middle Ages before experiencing a revival among the Puritans in the 17th century. In the second half of the 19th century, a particular variant of premillenarian eschatology, dispensationalism, which was popularized by the Irishman John Darby, spread increasingly in the USA. The adherents of this movement generally expect, and continue to expect, the moment when Jesus will return and, in one fell swoop, rapture the faithful Christians together with the dead into the clouds to meet the Lord. The unbelievers, whose activities will thus come to a shocking end, will remain on earth, where the 7-year reign of the Antichrist will begin. This time of tribulation reaches its climax in the final battle of Armageddon, when Christ and his armies defeat the Antichrist before he establishes his millennial kingdom. For many premillenarians, Israel plays an important role in this eschatological scheme. The return of the Jews to the Holy Land, according to John Darby, will be the sign of the beginning of the end times, and the Battle of Armageddon will be fought on Israeli soil. The evangelical William E. Blackstone, author of the extremely influential book Jesus is Coming, published in 1878, played a decisive role in popularizing this doctrine in the USA. When he learned in the course of the 1880s about the rapid increase in pogroms against Jews in the Tsarist Empire and the burgeoning Zionist movement, he did not hesitate to put his support into practice. He invited leaders of American Christianity and Judaism of his time to a conference, which resulted in the adoption of a resolution in solidarity with the Jews of Eastern Europe, and as early as 1891 he addressed the then-President Harris with the Blackstone Memorial Petition, calling on the USA to engage in the return of Palestine to the Jews in response to pogroms in Russia. In doing so, he made Christian Zionism, which neo-evangelicals still hold to today, a political force in America for the first time. The close connection between the end-time beliefs of evangelicals and their support for Israel is an easy target for ridicule, which anti-Zionists often use as a vehicle to delegitimize Israel. Laughter and snorts are always easy to come by when eschatological predictions that have never come true are retold in colorful detail. However, there are 2 reasons why we should not leave it at that. Firstly, it is important to realize how closely the rise of evangelicalism in its present form was linked to the experiences of the two world wars. From the 1910s at the latest, the dispensationalists embedded their apocalyptic visions in a constant and sometimes meticulous examination of geopolitical developments. Their apocalyptic message, which was based on a decidedly anti-German foreign policy, would never have found so many followers in America if it had not gained plausibility through the catastrophes of the 20th century and, at the same time, supposedly taken away some of their horror by offering itself as a meaningful interpretative pattern. The relative success of premillenaristic eschatology can thus also be decoded as an index of a collective avoidance of confrontation with the unspeakably negative, which is ideologically glossed over by integration into a divine plan of salvation. But it also testifies to a defensive and repressive reflex when abstracting from this historical background and acting as if the evangelical expectations of the end of time were the fantasies of deranged Yankees in a vacuum. Secondly, it is a simplification to reduce evangelical support for Israel to the belief in the end of time. The example of Blackstone shows that in Christian Zionism, other motives, such as moral indignation at the suffering of Russian Jews, have always played a role. And anyone who has read the statement of support quoted above will have to admit that the evangelicals are very well able to justify their support for Israel in terms of both political and civil religious provenance. This refers to a specifically U.S. American form of religiosity that cannot be attributed to any particular church, but has an integrative function for society as a whole by structuring the national self-image, for example the belief in America's election and God-given mission. Otherwise, they would not have been able to build up a series of pro-Israeli lobby organizations with close contacts to other Zionist groups in America and Israel after the Second World War. At that time, they were able to tap into an existing network. The politically and theologically more liberal mainline churches had also been committed to the founding and continued existence of the Jewish state since the 1920s. However, in the 1960s, they began to distance themselves from the Zionist project in a similar way to the New Left, and some of them now express openly anti-Israeli sentiments. The question arises as to whether this change of heart is not what actually needs to be explained, while the neo-evangelicals, increasingly isolated in this, are merely continuing an originally interdenominational, quasi-civic religious American Protestant tradition. On the political level, the evangelicals, despite isolated anti-Semitic statements from their ranks, can be seen as an objectively anti-Semitic force. However, the theological substance of their teachings is fundamentally in question. The self-designation as fundamentalists, which has been established among conservative evangelicals since the First World War, is misleading. In reality, their teachings are not the result of a return to the foundations of the Christian faith, but a creatio ex manipulo, a creation not from nothing, but also not from more than a handful of points of contact in the Christian tradition. The dispensationalism of Darby, the idiosyncratic reading of the books of Ezekiel, Daniel, and Revelation that went with it, and a specific understanding of biblical infallibility were particularly influential. Taking their cue from the ideal of philosophical empiricism as expounded by Francis Bacon, premillenarists applied his inductive method to the field of biblical exegesis. The first step should be to collect and sort out hard facts, i.e. passages from the Bible that are interpreted literally, and only then to formulate a system of general statements. This self-positioning of fundamentalists in a sensualist tradition may seem strange to outsiders. However, it is entirely logical against the backdrop of the rabid anti-Catholicism that characterized the evangelical movement for many decades, as it marks the demarcation from Aristotelianism, scholastic theology, and the history of the Church and dogma. After the Second World War, the protagonists of the movement began to distance themselves from the flag of fundamentalism, under which they had maneuvered themselves into a cultural no man's land by means of an offensive anti-Darwinist agenda, and sought new ways of mobilization, now calling themselves evangelicals again. The catalyst and result of this reorientation was the rise of Billy Graham. In September 1949, 2 days after President Truman announced that the Soviets had built an atomic bomb, the young Baptist preacher gathered his followers in Los Angeles for the first of a series of revival meetings and then toured the United States for weeks as a celebrated star. By the mid-1950s, he was already so well known that he was flown to Paris, where, among others, Roland Barthes was present at his appearance. If God really speaks through the mouth of Dr. Graham, then one has to say that God is quite foolish, Barthes noted in retrospect. In any case, God is obviously no longer Thomist, because logic strongly resists him. Billy Graham's performance broke with a demand for the Catholic or Protestant sermon that has been handed down from ancient culture, namely the demand for conviction in the medium of rational speech. Graham replaced the logocentric method of the classical sermon with a method of magical transformation through suggestion. Quote, "The hasty way of speaking, the systematic avoidance of any rational content, the incessant breaking of logical connections, the repetition of words, the theatrical pointing to the Bible, but above all the lack of any warmth, the obvious contempt for others, all this belongs to the classic hypnosis techniques of the variety show." Quote end. With a little goodwill, a publication from the 1990s that was influential in evangelical circles can be read as a late response to Barth's. In 1991, the theologian and pastor Douglas Wilson published Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning, an approach to distinctively Christian education, thereby contributing significantly to the popularization of the idea of a classical Christian education, while also explicitly criticizing Christian anti-intellectualism. The movement, now known as classical education and supported by a considerable network of private schools and parents who educate their children at home, pursues the goal of a holistic education that is oriented in the broader sense to the classics of the Western canon, and in the narrower sense to classical antiquity, both formally, through a step-by-step model that leads from grammar to logic to rhetoric, and in terms of content, through the study of the works of Homer, Sophocles, Thucydides, Plato, and Plotinus, for example. The decisive question for the future of classical education, whose appeal extends beyond evangelical circles, will be whether it is actually able to take the problem of, also specifically evangelical alienation from this tradition seriously, and to face it in the awareness of its own inadequacies, or whether it instead relies on adorning itself with big names and the aura of sublime historicity in the cultural battle against woke and against the public education sector. At first glance, the results of this political assessment of the position of Christianity may seem sobering for those who share the conservative impulses of Hirsi Ali. The question of which denomination today embodies the desire to uphold the Judeo-Christian tradition and to use it as a weapon in the conflict with the internal and external enemies of the West cannot be answered in the affirmative. While it cannot be said of the decidedly pro-Israeli and pro-Western neo-evangelicals that they credibly embody a Judeo-Christian tradition that goes back to antiquity, the Catholic and Protestant clergy of the Old Continent have in recent decades, with a certain consistency, placed themselves in the service of those forces that endanger this tradition. That they would thereby betray their own heritage is only half the truth, however. In its 2,000-year history, Christian Europe has been characterized by an historically unparalleled ability to question and relativize itself. In this, it has an example in Herodotus, who in the 5th century BC developed a proto-ethnological method of depicting the cultural practices of non-Greek peoples in his histories, which presupposes an understanding that one's own customs are not to be taken for granted as absolute. In this sense, the Western universalism of reason always includes the willingness to consider the possibility that foreign ways of life may have something to offer that our own, long-established ways do not. It cannot therefore be defended in the same unproblematic way as a community that is convinced from the outset of the superiority of its particular constitution. This results in a specific vulnerability of Western societies. The phenomena that today also stand for a tendency of self-dissolution in the churches of Western Europe, the exaggerated sensitivity for the concerns of other cultures, the insistence on an abstractly understood human dignity, which is used as a legitimization for a policy of open blindness to the achievements of European civilization, are thus less the result of a deviation from the right path than, in part, parodies or perversions, manifestations of a problem that is as old as the West itself. The French philosopher Rémi Brague attributes the fact that Europe differs so fundamentally from Islam or China in this respect to a specifically Roman awareness of its own cultural second-class status. Rome is characterized insofar as the name is not only taken as a place name, but rather as a symbol analogous to Athens and Jerusalem, by the fact that it knows that its sources are outside itself. Its origins, Greek and Jewish, do not belong to it, but rather stand before it as something foreign, from which it knows itself to be dependent, because it owes its own to it. Brague defines Christianity, that is, specifically the Roman Catholic Church, as the paradigmatic embodiment of this attitude and thus not merely as a content, but as the form of Western civilization. If the latter is endangered, so is the former. However, the answer to this danger cannot consist of a mantra-like invocation of Christian tradition, as if for political purposes. For this tradition, as the above remarks should have made abundantly clear, cannot be found in any tangible form. It is not readily available and never has been. Rather, it has always been the result of a movement of appropriation of foreign and contradictory, because on the one hand Greek and on the other hand Jewish origins, arising from the painful feeling of one's own inferiority. The many renaissances on European and American soil were repeatedly characterized by the fact that they were able to wrest a perspective from the old texts that shifted or shattered the existing horizon of meaning, and thus were not suitable as a shield for the West against internal and external threats. Conversely, the politically motivated attempt to reduce Greek philosophy, Roman law, medieval theology, and the Enlightenment to a common denominator often obscures the understanding of the individual subject and thus contributes to the crystallization of the tradition into clichés, from whose continued vitality one hopes for salvation. Contrary to what Hirsi Ali suggests, the political side of defending the West cannot be completely reconciled with the salvation of its intellectual substance. While pragmatism is needed to form alliances and the courage to define enemies, only work on the concept and, perhaps even more important today, immersion in the forgotten word can point the way. For centuries, the Catholic clergy have not been bothered by being perceived as a clandestine association of dark opponents of progress, whose need for public exchange of views is limited. By contrast, the most recent statements by the German bishops convey a sense of niceness that sounds almost desperate and testifies to their awareness of their own objective superfluity. An example of this last-minute panic is the synodal path that the German bishops decided on in March 2019 in response to their miserable press, which centers on the criticism of the Church's handling of sexual abuse and abuse allegations. The internal self-reflection, which is scheduled to last 2 years, is not only aimed at reforms regarding the Church's substantive orientation and its internal power structures. Rather, the habitus of its own representatives is to be tailored to the notorious willingness of the therapeutic society to engage in dialogue. In an honest, open, and self-critical dialogue, various topics are discussed and the significance of faith and the Church in the modern world is reflected upon. End of quote. Whether the celebrated willingness to engage in self-criticism will be able to improve the battered reputation or even slow the decline in membership is questionable, however. The current anti-Catholicism in Germany has deeper-rooted causes that cannot be eliminated with a renovated marketing strategy. In the postmodern ideological establishment, the Catholic Church is a foreign body. What once characterized it is no longer compatible with contemporary forms of socialization and subjectivity. What is more, the final sequence of the Lord's Prayer, in which the kingdom, the power, and the glory are invoked in eternity, has more potential to traumatize than to enlighten the sensitized contemporaries. The objectivity and claim to undivided truth that these lines demand appear to contemporary consciousness either as a totalitarian, Eurocentric presumption towards marginalized individual subjectivities, robbed of their emotional authenticity, or as a quaint anachronism that the transcendentally deeply relaxed world community, expanding in a multicultural and multiconfessional way, no longer needs. The current Catholic Reform debate in Germany, which is not really a debate because conservative counterpositions are not present in the public arena, is focusing on interests that have been driving the politically and reform-minded part of the Catholic base for years. The fact that papal councils or the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in Rome have a say in what happens in Germany's parishes and churches is causing increasing unease. The spirit of creative subjectivism also prevails in the Catholic milieu, to the extent that people want to set their own accents when it comes to the generally prescribed display of politically consensual attitudes, which is why edifying participatory services are very popular, in which the altar is transformed into a stage for self-penned and self-painted works. In other words, a place where, contrary to Catholic orthodoxy, the subjects of the faith community do not confront the objectified truth of themselves, but are allowed to try out and live out their own selves as permanently tinkering individuals. For the purpose of such autonomy efforts, the Catholic movement We Are Church has been calling for more appreciation of the activities of laypeople and more independence for local churches for over 25 years, which usually goes hand in hand with anti-Roman invectives. One of the specific features of the situation in Germany is that anti-Catholicism is not just a passion of church opponents, but also functions as an element of Catholic socialization itself. Even priests who are decidedly loyal to Rome have been unable to do much to counter the widespread notion that the whole paraphernalia of the Roman Church ultimately suppresses the free-floating genuine faith of pious Christians. What is new is that parts of the episcopate are now also regularly coming up with reform proposals that openly aim to Protestantize Catholicism. Such plans are being viewed with skepticism in the Vatican. Even Pope Francis, who is not generally known for blocking anything new, clearly indicated in his letter to the German people published last year that German Catholics should also see themselves as part of the Universal Church, whose primary task is not to adapt to the spirit of the times, but to inspire people to love Jesus Christ. He has achieved nothing with this, on the contrary. In recent months, the conflict between German Reformed Catholicism and the Roman Catholic Church has intensified noticeably. With the election of the Limburg Bishop George Batzing to the head of the German Bishops' Conference in March 2020, the camp of those who want nothing more than a rapprochement between Catholics and Protestants has gained a prominent advocate. Batzing stands for the dialogue orientation expected in the country, publicly reflects on interreligious holidays, and has a penchant for politically correct platitudes. The delighted chancellor, who, due to her GDR socialization, has an essentially Protestant or rather Protestant atheist attitude, knows what Catholicism needs. Immediately after Batzing's election, she said that his openness and willingness to talk predestined him to fulfill the coming tasks with foresight and continue the reform process within the Catholic Church. Radio E. April 3, 2020. In Rome alone, the German consensus wishes are still being brazenly torpedoed. In September, the far-sighted reformer received the answer to the letter Together at the Lord's Table, which he co-signed with some delay. The letter advocates the mutual participation of Catholics and Protestants in the celebrations of the Eucharist and the Lord's Supper. In it, it is lamented that many believers in the parishes hardly have any understanding for differentiated theological justifications that prevent them from celebrating the Protestant Lord's Supper or the Catholic Eucharist together. However, it is precisely this intellectual effort that the Curia Cardinal and Prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, Luis Ladaria, who was summoned to Rome by Pope Benedict XVI at the time, expects of them. The differences that still exist between the Catholic Church and the Reformation traditions in their understanding of the Eucharist and ministry do not allow, according to Ladaria, the Eucharist and the Lord's Supper to be equated in theological terms. Tagespost, September 19, 2020. The vote for ecumenical cooperation lacks a commitment to the real presence of Christ, which is at the center of the Catholic Eucharistic liturgy. The demand to allow all baptized people to participate in the Eucharist, regardless of their confession, on the basis of their conscience, presupposes a separation of sacrament and church, which is unacceptable according to Catholic understanding. In addition, the Catholic Mass requires its participants to testify to their communion with the Pope, the Bishop in charge, the Virgin Mary, and all the saints, as well as the deceased, which should be a matter of dispute for non-Catholics, despite all efforts to achieve harmony, but which the church politicians who are willing to reform do not want to discuss. The authors of the Süddeutsche Zeitung article of September 25, 2020, say that they do not want to be deterred from their path by the brake pad from Rome. They have already experienced no recognition too often. The answer to the question of who participates in what should, on the other hand, be based on a purely conscientious decision, ibid. What is intended to sound liberal and humanistic, but in reality testifies to an anti-intellectual addiction to harmony, is, as Christian Geyer correctly summarized in the FAZ, the invasion of postmodern relativism in theology and ecclesiology. It is part of the epistemic irony that a Vatican authority, which emerged from the historical Inquisition, is acting here as an advocate of differentiated theological argumentation, while German working group theology is being sounded out by the head of the Bishops' Conference as a servant of a church political agenda. October 7, 2020. The fact that the Orthodox hold fast to the truth and value church regulations, which Luther already cursed as man-made rules, more highly than the need for interdenominational reconciliation ceremonies, usually makes them appear to the public as stubborn, power-hungry people and the real traitors of the faith. At the same time, it seems that people are no longer able to understand that the Catholic Church is organized as a decidedly traditional institution whose decision-makers are not guided by worldviews that are recognized by the majority or by prevailing emotions, but claim to argue from the dogmatized theological revelation. The Regensburg Bishop Rudolf Voderholzer, one of the most outspoken critics of the synodal path, tried to explain the standards of Catholic orthodoxy to a public that is simply not interested in contrary positions. In my opinion, what is missing is a theological hermeneutics recognized by all participants and the affirmation of the principles of Catholic faith, which allows for the strongest arguments to be based on scripture, tradition, the teaching authority of the church and councils, etc. Diocese of Regensburg, September 26, 2018, because it is becoming increasingly difficult to tolerate an institution that places little value on authenticity, diversity, or equal opportunities, in the midst of a nervous political community that is polarized towards a single opinion. But rather, it demands that its members, who ultimately decide to join the religious community of their own free will, adapt to established dogmas and historically evolved forms, and this aversion, which sometimes turns into open hatred, grows even when the Church, which is striving for purification, reaches out to people, as is often said in the jargon of the actuality, which Adorno criticized in detail in a Protestant phrase. The appetite for scandals that are prepared by the media is correspondingly great, in which yesterday's destroyers of delicate self-realization desires are exposed as corrupt sinners who fail in the most amoral way to meet their own standards. When Heribert Prantl, for example, directs sentences like this against the Church, the male-bonding power structures are a perversion. The audience will not ask what concept of perversion he is basing his pathologization on. Instead, they will enthusiastically agree with him and curse the sick machinations in this malicious state within a state, Klaus Kleber, a little more coarsely than the head of the Süddeutsche Zeitung. And the beauty of beating up on the representatives of tradition, because everyone is of the same opinion, the likelihood that the authoritarian number will be exposed at some point is low. In this context, it is remarkable that in a country that is producing more and more industrious text processing revisionists, no one has the idea of dealing with the continuity of genuine German anti-Catholicism, which started with Luther, culminated in the idea during National Socialism that Catholicism was corrupting the German character, and today serves as the cheapest way to cultivate a projective enemy image. The similarities between the strict religious fight against hypocrisy, double standards, and the enjoyment of privileges with the forerunners of the angry middle classes were already recognized by Heinrich Heine, who read the Reformation struggle against the grain and conceded that German anti-Catholicism was an idealistic revivalist movement that was striking out against practical materialism in the name of inwardness and purity, which is not at all foreign to Catholicism. Due to the obsession with virtue, the fight against Catholic moralists in Germany was not fought out with slippery humor in a satirical way, as it was in France, but with blunt drooling. The indulgence peddlers were chased away, the pretty priest concubines were exchanged for cold wives, the charming images of the Madonna were broken, and here and there the most puritanical anti-sensualism arose. Heine correctly recognized that Catholicism, by its very nature, does not seek to compulsively eliminate or deny the contradiction between spirit and matter, i.e. between God and instinct. Rather, Catholicism should be understood as a concordat between the two spheres, whereby the sole rule of the spirit is expressed in theory, but matter is put in a position to exercise all its annulled rights in practice. This is clearly illustrated by the system of concessions that help sensuality to express itself in forms that condemn the drive, but in practice protect the spirit from its mocking usurpations. Instead, a social character has been able to assert itself in this country that fundamentally lacks an awareness of its own imperfection, but tries to compensate for this with a great deal of moralism. Then as now, the lachrymose pursuing conformism of the subjectivists feels provoked both by thinking that cannot be collectivized and by a sensuality that can never be completely regulated by the state. The group Maria 2.0, which campaigns nationwide for women in the priesthood and the abolition of celibacy, is a pars pro toto example of the topicality of this virtuous self-righteousness. The Catholic women, who act with the gestures of the late but intensely enlightened, write accusatory kitsch texts with a positive reference to Jesus, collect signatures and call for a church strike. Their specialty is victimization. The activists shamelessly plaster their mouths shut and look sad and angry at the same time into the camera, or they appear collectively and dressed in white at Sunday Mass, where the surprised congregation is supposed to feel the spirit of innocence. The unease that women make a decisive contribution to the preservation of Catholic parish life, but are excluded from the priesthood, which is considered desirable, for theological reasons that are not very sound, is quite understandable. However, anyone who experiences their voluntary church engagement as follows should consider changing their job as soon as possible. The breath of absolutist clerical power hovers over us like a dark cloud, suffocating everything we cherish and nurture. Simply staying away or even leaving the church to get some air is not an option, however. The group's homepage explains why, despite all the disputes, the church is still a home that should not be left to the unteachable without a fight. And it's not pitch black after all, because in the midst of the clerical darkness, a star shines in black, red, and gold. Quote, "In our democracy, we trust that the good human qualities will prevail and prevail. Reason, responsibility, empathy, community spirit, so that our common good is born by this spirit. For us Christians in Germany, our faith in Jesus Christ is particularly strengthening. And yet, it is precisely in this environment that faith in the church is evaporating. You are mistaken if you think that people are starving for a clerical theocracy." Zeit, April 9, 2020. There is no longer a hunger for a theocracy, at least not in Christianity. However, decentralized and therapy-like Bible circles or bleak gymnasium services are not exactly popular either. Nor is the joyless culture of dialogue that those in need of orientation build up with a cuddly God concretized as a lucky charm considered worthy of imitation. After all, the Protestant Church, which has almost everything in its program that frustrated Catholics want, has lost a few more members over the last few decades. Bad taste has never been a criterion for judgment in this country, and that is also why the Maria 2.0 initiative is taken more seriously than it deserves in terms of the quality of its interventions. In a message of solidarity entitled Je suis Marie, which was also signed by Federal Minister Jens Spahn, it is stated very originally and apparently in the conviction that clerics committed to Catholic tradition would object to such banalities, which can be heard in every Sunday sermon. Quote, Jesus proclaimed his message to all people equally, regardless of gender and regardless of who loves whom. Zeit, October 7, 2019. At least Spahn's involvement shows that the Christian message is still present in his mind. The contribution of Christianity to the development of the category of the individual, in particular through the assertion of a soul in the image of God in every human being, as well as to the civilization of the West in general, is hardly perceived anymore. Spahn's support for the current reform efforts, however, is probably mainly for socio-political reasons. In line with the currently particularly aggressive sound of the disciplining welfare state, Catholicism is to become a mediating welfare religion in the service of the German government. A function that goes beyond the spiritual support of the state's educational and paternalistic care system is hardly envisaged anymore. Under this premise, the institution of the Church is also being targeted as the fifth column of an outdated power. The discovery by Brigitte Vielhaus, National Director of the Catholic Women's Association of Germany, that during the crisis, a variety of forms of worship and prayer have developed in the family circle is certainly a step in the right direction, especially since the relationship with God in these house churches has been more intense than ever before. FAZ, April 9, 2020. However, according to Catholic doctrine, the Church does not merely have an organizing and transmitting function, but should also awaken the longing for the greater Benedict XVI. Not least for this reason, cathedrals are among the most beautiful things that Catholicism has to offer. In terms of church politics, the Church as a community of faith is also part of the message itself. It is largely thanks to the communitization of the Church through ritual and, inextricably linked to this doctrine, that the Catholic Church is free of any sectarian tendencies. Its insistence on the centrally transmitted and thus objective form predestines it to be the opponent of esoteric arbitrariness, which is why it was already critical of this before it became fashionable to view esotericism with suspicion. While the Second Vatican Council initiated the trivialization of the Catholic liturgy and replaced the wealth of presentational symbolism with a verbalism that was as devoid of history as it was hostile to the senses, thereby transforming church spaces into lecture halls, such home church pedagogy with Catholic set pieces regresses to an esoteric tragedy and a parody of transcendence. What was once valid and important but no longer fits into the politically correct everyday world is not placed in a historical context and related to the present, but is perceived as a narcissistic insult by people whose only pride is the apparent superiority of our contemporary picture book democracy. The poorly sublimated attack on church tradition is similar to the iconoclasm against works of art and statues these days, with the difference that Catholic women, unlike anti-sexists and anti-racists armed with hate messages or spray cans, have good manners and perhaps too much conscience to riot. In terms of individual believers, Christianity has always been characterized by ambivalence. The incarnation of God implied a genuine interest in reality, but at the same time the message "My kingdom is not of this world," John 18 verse 36, had the effect of making political content fade away. The Christian tendency to take the path of least political resistance in the midst of blatant injustice also stems from this. Today, the Christian reluctance to engage in silly activism is only found among a minority of conservative Catholics who, not without coquetry regarding old masses and beautiful churches, are alienated from politics and the standards on which it is based. By contrast, the representatives of the new Catholic religiosity are politically active and strive to harmonize the contradiction between the Catholic Church and the postmodern imperative of tolerance. On the one hand, the transcendent religious content is rationalized into a worldview, which also includes the elimination of the corporeal moment, which was able to come into its own in the old liturgy. On the other hand, The mixing of subjective piety and political engagement contributes to the irrationalization and infantilization of the political in such a way that affirmative political attitudes are increasingly preached in church services, or the priest lets the church bells ring against the AfD. The introduction of political propaganda into Catholicism is not only due to the efforts of the activists of the Sacred Heart or the feminist-inspired Bible study groups. It is above all the result of a process of adaptation that the Catholic Church has independently driven forward in the 20th century with the intention of not being left behind by history. The pontificate of Pope Francis is fueling this development towards more moralism, ecology, and anti-capitalism. His sermons against capitalism are hardly distinguishable from the shallow messages of left-wing parties, while the anti-aesthetic glorification of poverty serves the purpose of achieving mass appeal through demonstrative modesty. Compared to his predecessor, who placed faith and reason at the center of his work, Francis has replaced intellectual rigor with more populism. His latest encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, which also refers to the coronavirus between anti-capitalist curses, contains a crude critique of alienation that varies the idea that everyone in secular societies wears a mask anyway, and devalues the body as conveyed by social expression as degenerate compared to the natural mortal body. This encyclical also contains the first ever affirmative references to Islam for the purpose of inaugurating an ideology of world religions. Of course, an open confrontation with Islam, which a papal critique would inevitably lead to, would be risky, especially for Christians in predominantly Muslim areas, and it is not the Pope's job to criticize ideology. But the silence about the increasingly bloody worldwide hatred of Christians is a historical failure that is only surpassed by the fact that one even joins in the calculated Islamic whining about religious insults, instead of at least distancing oneself from this repulsiveness by remaining silent. In the 1970s, Pier Paolo Pasolini formulated an interpretation of Catholicism that stands in stark contrast to German church criticism. Pasolini's central thesis is that Catholicism, which in Italy has been linked to power for centuries, and the subjectivity that corresponds to it no longer fit into the social laws of motion of late capitalism. The new cycle of production and consumption presupposes pragmatic consumers who orient their satisfaction of needs to the entirely earthly, and thus leveled world of commodity exchange, and who consume Sunday services at most as a cultural break between work weeks. The new industrialists and the new technicians are completely secular, that is, of a worldliness that no longer measures itself against religion. This kind of secularism is a new value that has emerged in the entropy of bourgeois society, in which religion has withered away as an authority and form of rule and now survives only as a natural basis for mass consumption and exploitable folklore. End of quote. According to Pasolini, the new hedonism has an immediate effect on individuals, who in turn develop a disgusting practical urge for integration under the pressure of circumstances. The left, which continues to present itself as progressive and anti-clerical, instead of criticizing this development, wages a sham battle against outdated clerical reaction and, in conformist revolutionary fashion, sides with the wonderful forces of renewal. In doing so, he rejects the Catholic-influenced folk culture of the Italian workers and peasants, which cannot be fully integrated into the forms of commodity aesthetics, from his own class standpoint as ontologically different. In a way, Pasolini thus anticipates the criticism of the postmodern left, which has now become redundant in some cases. Pasolini interpreted the attack on Catholicism primarily in the context of Marx as a reflection of the totalization of the capital relationship. Today, the residues of religious tradition are confronted with a compulsory political confession that is not only conveyed by democratic education but also by the culture industry, so that the church is now supposed to deliver undignified and politically correct folklore, or even deliver it voluntarily. Pasolini still hoped that the oppressed would not put up with the impositions of a sterile, unlived life in the midst of a desolate collection of goods that lose their appeal over time, any more than they would put up with the tendency towards the sameness of all under the rule of capital. In fact, he believed he could discern traces of humanity in the ruins of tradition, such as a desire for happiness that had not yet been regulated and that stood in opposition to the standardization of the consumer society. In Adorno's words, theory is confronted with the obscure, the opaque, the ungraspable, which as such is anachronistic, but does not become obsolete because it outwits the historical dynamic. The political solution to this contradiction that Pasolini had in mind, however, sounds more like an anticipation of Pope Francis's agenda on church politics. Love of one's neighbor, properly understood, is revolutionary. Christ must be read as the negation of all rule. The injunction render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's, Matt 20:21, does not demand a false reconciliation, but rather embodies an irreconcilable opposition. The fact that Pasolini was not free of political activism is also evident from the fact that the Gospel, depending on the preferred passage and interpretation, can also be politicized in a way that is contrary to the critique of power, as Carl Schmitt did. He dedicated his life's work to the motto of a Catholic intensification against the neutralizers, the aesthetic Schlaraffen against fruit abortionists, corpse burners, and pacifists. In his attempt to politicize Catholicism in a way that would not abolish it, but rather reconcile it with the principles of revolutionary Marxism, Pasolini was by no means alone, at least among the Italian left of the time, which was openly or implicitly trying to unite Catholic and Marxist pathos under the label of a new materialism. Critical theory, whose exponents, especially in the case of Walter Benjamin, are usually understood as representatives of a tradition of social criticism committed to Jewish messianism, has always remained strangely exterritorial to Catholicism, from the 1920s to the period of exile and on to the phase of its mostly misunderstood reception by the student movement. Hardly any statements about the relationship between critical theory and Catholicism are known to have been made by members of the inner circle of the Institute for Social Research. And Adorno in particular, who was influenced more by Protestantism than by Judaism in his intellectual development, due in part to his early engagement with Soren Kierkegaard, is likely to have contributed to the ventilation of Protestant forms of thought in the Critique of Ideology, and later the New Left with his maxim of the ban on images and the truth that can only be determined by negating the false. At least his aesthetics of the shameless, the refusal of positive meaning and the asceticism towards the opulent, as developed in his aesthetic theory, is far more indebted to Protestantism than to a Judaism that Adorno, who was brought up as a Christian, only got to know late in life and mainly through Benjamin and Gershom Scholem. References to Catholicism, if any, are more likely to be found in the later work of Max Horkheimer than in Adorno's. Horkheimer has therefore also been seen as a key witness for a trend that has been developing since the 1960s under left-wing auspices towards the renewed politicization of religion. However, Horkheimer's comments on Catholicism, which were always only made in conversation and in notes, are less a sign of a newly acquired religiosity than of a newly awakened interest in theology, that is, a form of thinking that reflects on religion in the medium of the concept, rather than merely practicing it. In this sense, Horkheimer explained in his last interview with Der Spiegel in 1970, entitled What We Call Meaning Will Disappear, in which he also defended the Catholic Church's position on contraception. Critical theory has always had a dual task: to identify what needs to be changed and to preserve certain cultural moments. Furthermore, it has to describe the process of change to which our world is subject. I would say that theology should be renewed. It is not certain that there is an almighty God. Yes, we cannot even believe it in view of this world and its horror. End of quote. The quality of experience that is kept alive by religion and can be determined by theological reflection, which does not disappear with the decline of practiced religion, and for the sake of which theology should be renewed, is what Horkheimer calls the completely different and longing. Although they sound very similar in their reflection on the affinity between preservation and renewal, Horkheimer's considerations differ from those of Pasolini in their refusal to attribute an immediate potential for social change to theology. Rather, they use the term longing to describe a quality of experience in which the mind and the senses are neither, as in ecumenical Protestantized Catholicism, equally exorcised in the name of political convenience, nor, as in the regressive New Catholicism of Martin Mosbach, simply played off against each other. Unlike the hope that the new priests of conformism peddle, longing denotes the irreconcilability of sensuality and spirit by reminding us of the unity of the two. For some time now, Giorgio Agamben's 2000 and Alain Badiou's 1977 not-so-new readings of St. Paul have enjoyed a certain popularity in postmodern academic circles. In this context, Neo-Paulinism and its fans may be united by a longing for a regressive rebellion against the law, as many critics have rightly denounced. But as Christoph Turk has long known, you can't use Pauline theology for this without doing violence to it. And he criticizes it for doing just that. In this sense, he pursues the affirmation of the revolt with Jesus against Paul much more clearly and obviously than even Badiou and, especially, Agamben do with reference to Paul. Assuming a similarly one-sided dissolution of the dialectic between early Christianity and the Church as Gerhard Scheidt, Turk welcomes what the latter at least criticizes, and even imagines himself to be in agreement with Adorno. For a critical theory of Christianity, engaging with Turk seems to be much more productive than working through authors who, like Agamben, are more inclined to side with Taubes than Scholem, with Benjamin reduced to Schmidt than Adorno. For Turk, the central message of Paul's theology and that of the evangelists is the interpretation of Jesus' death on the cross, which he summarizes, somewhat simplistically, as died for our sins. Turk can convincingly demonstrate that the central dogmas, which are hinted at but not explicitly stated in the New Testament, such as the Trinity, the doctrine of the two natures and the virgin birth, necessarily result from died for our sins. He is therefore right to accuse the supposedly progressive Reformed theology of arbitrariness and a regression behind the claim to reason, in the sense of logical consistency, as conservative theology still represents it. If one insists on a remnant of rationality, one cannot explain individual dogmas that are now, such as the virgin birth, perceived as unpleasant, offensive, and out of date as being only metaphorical or allegorical instead of real and serious, and at the same time hold on to died for our sins as the non-metaphorical central content of theology. As is often the case with feminist-inspired Reformed theology, Turk's own radical critique of both conservative theology and Reformed theology is therefore directed at died for our sins itself, as it was with Scheidt. However, he does not see the problem in the fact that this formula stands for a regression against Judaism, Freud, or a perversion of Jewish messianism or hatred of legal mediation, Scheidt PM. Rather, he interprets it the other way around as a specifically Jewish, comforting mitigation of the political offensiveness of the historical Jesus. While the memory of the original messianic claim of the historical Jesus and the painful futility of his death on the cross would be the authentic Christian objection to the unredeemed state of the world, the falsifying theological interpretation, beginning with Paul, in Turk's view, precisely in the displaced reestablishment of the Jewish law, compensates for the absence of the parousia. In this way, the followers of Jesus would be reconciled with his agony on the cross, and, at the same time, with the old unreconciled world, reconciliation with the unreconciled. Turk's approach, which he presents as historical materialistic to psychoanalytical, consists, as he himself says, essentially in a radicalization of historical critical Jesus research. While theologians such as Rudolf Bultmann still admitted in the 1920s that nothing could be learned about the historical Jesus from the New Testament, but only theological interpretations of this figure, Jesus research believes that it is very well able to reconstruct the real Jesus from the Gospels. The method is based on three premises. Firstly, the Gospels are theologically interested, editorial treatments of orally transmitted traditions of the actual actions and words of a person who actually existed. Secondly, there are criteria for distinguishing the authentic Jesus from the edited Jesus in every formulation. Thirdly, Jesus' offensiveness is identified as the relevant criterion, especially for Turk, i.e. that the historical Jesus is said to have gone beyond all the coordinates of the Roman Jewish world in word and deed. The aim of the moderating editorial work is to bring Jesus back into this world, which, incidentally, includes identifying him as the Messiah promised in the Scriptures. A simple example. Mark reports the rejection that Jesus experienced during a sermon in the synagogue of his hometown. The people ask contemptuously, "Isn't this the carpenter, the son of Mary?" And they took offense at him and rejected him. Then Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor except in his hometown and among his own relatives and in his own family." Mark 6 verse 3f. The historical Jesus could have actually enjoyed little respect in his hometown and among his relatives, and not only because serious prophets were not carpenters. The crucial point is that in the Oriental world, a person who was born illegitimately or who does not have the man of his mother, in this case Joseph, as his father is referred to as the son of a mother, otherwise Jesus would be called the son of Joseph. The theological treatment is now cosmeticizing the offensive if it stylizes the son of Mary, which indicates a real bastard in the sense of died for our sins to a virgin birth, whereby the fatherless bastard gets God as a father, which has the dogmas of the Trinity and the doctrine of two natures as a logical prerequisite and consequence at the same time. According to Paul, Jesus can only take on sin if he is completely untouched by sin, and since sin has been propagated through sexual reproduction since the time of Adam, Jesus cannot be the result of a natural, whether lawful or unlawful, sexual act. Against the background of these three, in themselves already uncertain premises, Turk's materialism reconstructs its historical Jesus from the Gospels, whereby the narrow framework of unavoidable speculation is uninhibitedly blown up. Starting from the materialistic image of the historical Jesus, which is already due to a considerable degree of personal arbitrariness, Turk then attempts, in the next step, to interpret the Gospels with the tools of psychoanalytic dream interpretation as a shifting, condensing, symptomatic manifestation of the real historical events contained therein. The result of this method, which is questionable on the whole, is the following narrative. The historical Jesus was not only not subject to the law as Paul claimed, but in everything, in person, action, and words, nothing but a walking offense, an unbearable provocation of the, especially, but not only Jewish ancient world. As a zealot, he preached the unconditional love of enemies that Paul and the Gospels had toned down, and he implemented this in his actions to the very last consequence. As a healer, he treated the lepers of society without regard to their person and even shared bread with them in a ritualistic sense, against all regulations. In doing so, he did not take pity on beggars and prostitutes in a charitable socialist manner, which would have been a belittling ex post facto attempt to minimize the actual offense. Those whom he healed and those with whom he dined were real criminals or, like the tax collectors, hated Jewish collaborators of the Roman occupying power. In doing so, Jesus preached and lived out a resistance to the principle of equivalence, in order to both allegorically anticipate and actually hasten the kingdom of God, as he understood it. The principle of equivalence, according to which good is to be rewarded with good and bad with bad, which, according to Turk, dominates all moral philosophy from the ancient golden rule to Kant's categorical imperative, may be indispensable, given the way the world is organized, but it also expresses its unreconciled state. Jesus could not and did not want to imagine the kingdom of God as being initiated by the mere continuation of the logic of punishment, atonement, reward, and compensation, but rather as a truly reconciliatory act of grace that breaks with this logic. This attitude, according to Turk, who here follows Nietzsche's allusions in his decidedly anti-Pauline tract The Antichrist, identifies Jesus as the first immoralist in history. In a way comparable to Job's protest against the principle of equivalence, with the difference that Job was only a literary construct, whereas Jesus was a historical figure. If the real Jesus, as such an immoralist, had tried for months or years to bring about his kingdom of God, with the corresponding deeds and words, but to no avail, then at some point the decision was made to take a final step, which was in the inexorable logic of the matter. He had to move his activities to the center of the Jewish world, to Jerusalem, and attack its center, the temple. If he drove out the money changers as material representatives of the ideal principle of equivalence, then the kingdom of God could no longer do anything other than finally break out. As is well known, things turned out differently. As a criminal and troublemaker, which he objectively had to be in the eyes of his Jewish and Roman contemporaries at the latest with this desecration of the temple act, Jesus was crucified. Quote, "The real crucifixion of Jesus, a form of execution intended for political and religious rebels, was the brutal but legal punishment for the scandal of his appearance. As far as can be reconstructed, he was able to present in parables, healings, and symbolic acts in such a radical and spectacular way what would be reconciliation without all the misery and retribution, that he made the actual unreconciled and ungodly nature of the world stand out in an apparently unbearable way and drew the retribution of the law upon himself." End of quote. This exegesis, however, turns the murder of God by Jews into the legal killing of a Jewish revolutionary who opposed the wrong establishment of the world and must have broken its Jewish and Roman laws in a concrete way. Otherwise, the law's retribution would not be a legal receipt. With all due historical understanding for the reaction of the Jewish and Roman establishment, Turk sympathizes with a political rebellion against the law, a rebellion that he takes away the theological messianic mediation. Since Jesus, with parables, healings, symbolic acts, could not have really violated Roman law, either historically or logically, Turk is ultimately also concerned with the legality of an exclusively Jewish retaliation. Be that as it may, for Turk, the fate of Jesus and, taken as a political and philosophical problem in principle, that of today's madness meets madness. The commandment to love one's enemy could only be fulfilled where there is no more hostility, where it is superfluous. To want to fulfill it in this world is madness. But one must also see what it is resisting, that it always goes on like this, with injury after injury, violence after violence, and no end in sight. Is that any less delusional? Then, however, it goes quickly erasing all the contradictions that have just been identified, instead of reflecting on how delusion versus delusion stood in real history. The delusion of an exuberant desire versus the delusion of the principle of reality, Christianity, Paul, and the Church, has, according to Turk, taken the side of the principle of equivalence and sharpened it. And not only that, quote, "When Jesus resisted the principle of equivalence, it was still in its infancy." In the meantime, it has taken the form of global capitalism. No other religion has contributed as much to this as Christianity. It not only held up the principle of equivalence against Jesus, it also helped him to achieve his capitalist breakthrough. End of quote. Quite apart from the somewhat crude anti-capitalism, this is extremely questionable. On the one hand, Turk misinterprets the image of Jesus that he himself has created, either trivializing what Jesus supposedly did as the delusion of a childlike exuberant desire or even glorifying it in the pseudo-spirit of critical theory. Jesus is the first martyr of non-equivalence, of the non-identical Adorno, as one may say without exaggeration. End of quote. On the basis of Turk's speculations, it would be much more plausible to thematize Jesus' actions not as childlike, but as infantile and blindly raging against the principle of reality, a raging that, in its headlessness, inevitably leaves at least open the question of whether the hostility applies to violence and domination in mediation, or to mediation per se. On the other hand, Turk misinterprets his own truncated image of Paul when he ascribes to Paul, and with him to Christianity, the equivalence and reality principle. For it is precisely in what Turk accuses Paul of doing in comparison to Jesus, namely passively expecting the end of this world and thus also the end of the equivalence and reality principle, instead of actively pushing for it like Jesus, that the dialectic of delusion versus delusion is reflected, which could only be an unresolved objection to the unreconciled state of the world. When Turk aligns himself with the historical Jesus against official Christianity, he not only practices himself, albeit on the opposite side, what he falsely accuses Paul of doing, namely taking sides with the delusion, but he makes it even worse. Ultimately, there are two forms of false reconciliation: reconciliation with the unreconciled of this world, settling in the uninhabitable, Brecht, is, as an ideological false life, the redemption from the unredeemed world in a suicidal rampage is no life at all. It is not clear why keeping the memory of the latter alive, and this is what Turk's exegesis basically calls for, should be an objection to this world in the name of a right and good life. On the contrary, while such an impulse is indeed essential to Islam and partially to Protestantism, the only thing one can reproach Catholicism for in this context is that its reworking of Pauline theology vacillates precisely in the mediation between reproduction and the critique of unreconciledness. In his book on the dramaturgy of antisemitism, Skytte had understood this as the ambiguity of a world that is already redeemed, but still awaits redemption, proclaimed by Christianity. Since then, it seems to have become more difficult to tolerate this ambiguity. There is no longer to be anything between law-abiding behavior on the one hand and running amok on the other.